Zentralblatt für Okkultismus, 1912-13, English Audiobook Edition, Part 1. Translated from PDF pages 9 to 75 of the supplied scan. This lean edition is prepared for text-to-speech. Running headers, page numbers, subscription notices, image captions, and most bibliographic footnotes have been omitted, to avoid paying to narrate material that is not part of the main reading. Article titles, bylines, and substantive prose are retained. Because the source is an old image scan, occasional OCR uncertainty may remain. Historical, medical, and occult claims are translated as part of the source text, not presented as advice. Attempts to establish a scientific experimental magic by Dr. L. Staudenmaier, Professor of Experimental Chemistry at the Royal Lyceum in Freising. In the history of all peoples and all ages, magic has played an important role. Nevertheless, up to the present, it has not been possible to find a scientific point of approach for practicing it systematically. Indeed, modern science is generally inclined to explain it as error and self-deception. In what follows, on the basis of my own experiments, conducted exclusively upon myself, and now extending into their 10th year, during which I shrank from neither effort and exertion, nor even dangerous and cruel procedures, I wish to show as briefly as possible that magic actually exists, and that it in no way contradicts generally recognized laws of nature and facts of experience. On the contrary, in its basic features, it can be brought entirely into harmony with our modern scientific knowledge and explained by it. A detailed account of my development during this long period, which is by no means yet complete, must be postponed to later years. On the magic of the conscious ego. When I look at a light before me, such as a burning candle, the excitation passes from the retina through the diencephalon to the visual centers and the relevant association areas, and finally to consciousness. The more exact course of this process in the cerebral cortex has not yet been satisfactorily explained, but knowledge of it is not necessary for the following discussion. If I close my eyes and exert pressure on them, and thus upon the retina, the excitation proceeds along the same pathways as before, and I again see light. Mere mechanical stimulation of the peripheral nerve region is therefore sufficient to make one see light with full vividness, even though no light is actually present. If conversely I now imagine light, only the relevant regions of the cerebral cortex are at first excited. Ideas voluntarily called up afterward through memory are therefore as a rule not especially vivid or distinct, though they are sufficient for ordinary thought. But if I deliberately try to imagine light with exceptional vividness, so that the excitation of the cortical regions just mentioned becomes unusually strong, then, according to my experience, and once the necessary practice has been acquired, this excitation can descend from there through the diencephalon and ultimately to the terminal distribution of the optic nerve, the retina. One then really sees light again, just as under the mechanical stimulation of the optic nerve described above, although no such light is present. One has a hallucination of light. Here the excitation first passes through the optical system in exactly the reverse direction. Then, as it propagates backward again toward the cerebral cortex, it acts upon consciousness like a light actually located outside the body. Thus one stages the play, so to speak, and at the same time becomes its spectator. There is no obvious difficulty in such a conception, since it has long been shown that every nerve can conduct in the reverse direction as well. In this manner, it is possible to evoke not only hallucinations of the simplest kind, but also more complicated ones, for example of people, animals, and flowers. In a completely analogous way, an auditory hallucination may be produced when the excitation finally extends to the peripheral distribution of the auditory nerve in the cochlea, and from there through the endolymph, paralymph, and auditory ossicles to the eardrum. Since the production of auditory hallucinations is independent of the human speech organs, one can imitate not only one's own voice, but also the voices of other people, as well as animals, and so forth. In the same way, one may conjure up arbitrary tones and noises, even the most beautiful music, with realistic deception. By simultaneously combining different hallucinations, one may imagine a person speaking or singing, or a flower giving off a scent. In short, with suitable practice and disposition, while the eyes are closed in the stillness of night, one may voluntarily produce, by means of the mental eye and the mental ear, a phantom world modeled on the external world or modified at will. Visual, auditory, olfactory, sensory, kinesthetic, and so forth. Occasionally, unusually constituted persons have possessed the ability to call forth such hallucinations, or have perceived them accidentally without having previously performed special exercises. Examples include Cardanus, Goethe, Johannes Müller, Nageli, and Leroy. Cardanus wrote, in effect, that he could see what he wished, though not always whenever he wished. What he saw was continually in motion, and he could see groves, animals, spheres, and whatever else he desired. The Austrian popular dramatist Ludwig Anzengruber, when asked how he wrote his plays, answered, "When I write, I see the people before me. I hear them speak. I move them about on the stage." An especially vivid power of imagination is common among artists and painters, although an intensification of it into actual hallucination is probably rare. There are, of course, various intermediate stages all the way to the extreme. Even the most vivid hallucination initially remains something subjective that cannot be perceived by other persons. The question is whether such a hallucination might be carried so far that it becomes objective and real. I maintain that it can. The hallucinations described above already contain something objective and real. If through the most vivid possible imagination of light, I set my retina into a state of excitation, then this excitation must necessarily communicate itself to the surrounding ether and set it into corresponding vibrations. Those vibrations are what we call light. The light thus produced will pass through the refracting media of the eye in the direction opposite to that of ordinary vision. At the place where I imagine the light to be, a real image will appear. The excited point of the retina is therefore the starting point of a movement of the ether, and the refracting media of the eye produce a real external image in a manner comparable to a convex lens. The same applies analogously to an auditory hallucination. The excitation that propagates from the cochlea through the auditory ossicles on both sides to the eardrums sets them, and with them the surrounding air, into corresponding vibrations. These vibrations are projected as real sound toward the place from which I imagine the sound to come, although not with the same precision as in the optical apparatus. The principle involved is that any apparatus capable of receiving vibrations of the ether, light in our case, can conversely also produce vibrations of the ether, or that an apparatus sensitive to vibrations of the air, tones, can likewise produce vibrations of the air if a stream of energy is sent through it in the reverse direction. The original simple arrangement of the telephone, as it was actually used in earlier times, may serve as a comparison. When one speaks against its membrane, the membrane vibrates, much like the eardrum. These vibrations produce induction currents in a copper wire wound around a magnet. The currents travel along the telephone wire to the telephone of the person with whom one wishes to converse, pass through the otherwise identical apparatus in exactly the opposite sequence, and finally set its membrane into vibration. The membrane now, so to speak, speaks, whereas in the telephone of the speaking person it had previously listened. The images or sounds projected outward by imagination alone are evidently too weak to be perceived by other persons. I do not know whether they might be detected by especially exact physical or chemical means. For example, whether optical ideas might be projected onto an extremely sensitive photographic plate. There are, however, means of strengthening them. From a purely physical standpoint, our body is an extraordinarily complicated system of apparatuses, consisting of optical, acoustic, motor, and numerous other mechanisms. Although these can be distinguished individually and are to a certain degree independent of one another, they nevertheless form in the final analysis a connected whole, a unity, since ultimately all are joined by nerve fibers and none is completely isolated. Excitations can therefore radiate from one region into another. Strong stimulation of the eyes by glaring light, for example, produces an urge to sneeze in some persons. It is also known that pain can release sensations of pleasure if the excitation passes into another organ capable of pleasurable sensation, and one directs attention not to the pain but to the pleasure. Through practice, this can supposedly be brought to considerable perfection. Ordinary reflexes belong here as well. A visual or auditory perception can reflexively produce a defensive movement, or set the speech organs in motion. From this point of view, we may speak quite generally of a law of the irradiation of nervous energy. When energy passes from one nerve region into another, a specific transformation of that energy takes place. Under normal conditions, however, such irradiation and transformation of nervous energy usually occurs only in small quantities. If, for example, a visual perception reflexively evokes a defensive movement, the smaller amount of energy passing from the optical into the motor region does not itself produce the defensive movement. It merely serves as a trigger, as an impulse by which the potential energy stored in the relevant muscular region is converted into actual energy. In abnormal constitutions, pathological states, and especially through practice, however, this irradiation of nervous energy may become considerably more important, as the following will show. We possess in our bodies a substantial reserve of energy. We release it chiefly through the motor system by muscular contraction and put it to our use. By means of it, we can not only transport the weight of our own bodies, but also move heavy loads, generate enough heat to keep ourselves warm even in the severest winter, and so forth. If I brace myself with my hands and feet, or take a heavy object into my hands, the energy released by muscular contraction is ordinarily transformed into heat. But if, at the same time, to the exclusion of other ideas, I hold a single idea, for example, an optical one, as vividly and forcefully as possible, and try to see it like a real object standing before me, then with practice it gradually becomes possible, I maintain, to direct an ever greater portion of the energy released by muscular contraction backward along the motor nerve pathways to the motor spheres of the cerebral cortex. From there, it may be carried through corresponding association pathways into the optical system, transformed there into optical energy, and used to intensify the light effect of visual ideas. In this way, a hallucination projected outward in the manner described above could eventually become visible to other persons without special aids. That the development of muscular energy is of particular importance seems evident to me from my own experience, because during especially vivid hallucinations, I regularly and instinctively assume strenuous bodily postures, which, if held forcefully, can become extremely painful. To a lesser degree, even an ordinary person is influenced bodily by intense mental activity. Attentive listening, for example, causes one to hold the breath and tense certain muscles. Joy, pain, and sorrow produce changes in the entire posture and in facial expression. Among all the magicians of antiquity, the law of irradiation of nervous energy plays, in my view, an extraordinarily important role. Methods of the most varied kinds, usually unpleasant ones, such as hunger, cold, night vigils, holding the breath, strenuous postures, kneeling for hours, and even bodily mistreatment, were employed in order to obtain nervous energy at any price. A scientific magic, however, would chiefly seek to obtain it from the place where it exists in greatest quantity and is most easily available, the muscles. Because the connections in the cerebral cortex are extraordinarily numerous and permit an almost unlimited number of possibilities, one must endeavor to develop only certain pathways and prevent the energy from spreading into other regions. To train optical hallucinations, one should observe a flower, painting, or statue as attentively as possible, close the eyes, and then try by imagination alone to see the object before oneself with the same vividness and reality as immediately before. If the clear image gradually fades, one opens the eyes again for a time and studies the object anew. With time, according to the author, it becomes possible to see a clear hallucination of the object with closed eyes, while at the same time the body gradually and almost of itself assumes a strenuous posture or position. When the optical apparatus is generally excited, the hallucinations are often surrounded by brilliant light, somewhat like the familiar luminous figures produced by pressing upon closed eyes. To learn what the author calls feeling at a distance, and to produce effects at a distance, he recommends a procedure analogous to the training of spirit writing. One first takes a small light pencil between the first 3 fingers of the right hand and places its point on paper, sometimes drawing it across the paper as in writing. At the same time, one directs particular attention to the fingertips, to their points of contact with the pencil, and especially to the pencil point. The purpose is, on the one hand, to drive as strong a stream of energy as possible into the fingers, and on the other, to heighten and become familiar with the sensations and muscular feelings involved in holding and directing the pencil. Later, as practice increases and the supposed energy current toward the fingertips becomes stronger, with a perceptible amount already passing beyond their surface, one should try to hold the pencil less and less by direct contact, and more by means of the outflowing energy, until it might finally be possible to make it float freely without direct contact, and to direct it from a greater or lesser distance. An excellent means of practicing and controlling weaker distant effects, he says, is a sensitive balance capable of indicating fractions of a milligram. One sits before it, directs attention toward one pan, and seeks in thought to feel it and press it downward by means of the right hand, that is, by means of an imagined hand, or even without such an imagined hand. If, in the manner described, one drives larger quantities of nervous energy into various organs, those organs will naturally, the author claims, become more strongly developed. A greater blood supply, and therefore better nourishment, will occur at the same time, so that their capacity will increase with time. Upon close observation, he says, one can feel the relevant organs swell at the beginning of an experiment when the stream of energy enters it. One should therefore not object that our nervous apparatus, the eye, the ear, and so on, are much too delicate to produce any noticeable effects by such means. On the basis of his own experience, Staudenmaier declares that even the most sensitive organs can, through long continued practice, be made incredibly resistant, and can temporarily be placed in a condition in which even serious injuries heal in a surprisingly short time, because energy is quickly supplied to them, as it were, from the entire body. In such a condition, he suggests, they gradually appear less like purely material structures, and more like energetic formations, against which even the crudest procedures can do little harm. He does not doubt that this will one day become medically significant. Nor does he doubt that the human being of the future, even in activities that appear purely mental, will increasingly enlist the body by tensing the muscles, holding the breath, and so on, producing a more extensive unification and centralization. Something of the sort already happens involuntarily, though only to a slight degree, during the most concentrated attention and intense thought. He compares this with practices used long ago by Indian religious founders to heighten memory and imagination, and to bring forth magical phenomena, though he characterizes their methods as senseless and barbaric. 2. On the magic of the unconscious. 1. Facts and attempts at theoretical explanation. At the beginning of my experiments in magic, I made rapid progress, so that I seemed to possess an extraordinarily strong disposition for it. I therefore believed that it would soon be easy for me to produce experiments that would provide convincing evidence for anyone. Gradually, however, very peculiar difficulties arose which made the possibility of a systematic magic increasingly doubtful to me, and forced me to surrender almost completely all the positions I had gained. I shall only briefly indicate my further development here. In order to obtain an exact measure of the distant effects I believed I was producing, I sat in front of a very sensitive balance, and tried by means of pressure at a distance to make one pan sink, and thus cause a corresponding deflection of the pointer. Frequently the pointer did not move in the direction I intended, but very distinctly in the opposite direction, and remained there for some time. When I then exerted myself all the more, and naturally became annoyed, the hallucination of a mocking figure with a long nose, appeared more and more distinctly upon the pointer of the ballots, and seemed to grin at me derisively. In other experiments as well, the more I overexerted myself, and the more nervous my condition became, the more unmistakably hostile manifestations appeared. Sometimes, for example, there was a knock on the window, a blow upon objects in the room, a bang, and so forth. Once, when I was standing in a state of great agitation in the garden beneath a small apple tree, two not quite ripe but completely healthy apples, still attached to pieces of leafy branch, were knocked down in rapid succession from two places separated laterally from one another. At times, I had the very distinct feeling that someone wanted to slap me in the face. In short, it gradually seemed as though more and more mischievous mocking spirits, and finally even malicious devils, wished to undo everything I had laboriously achieved. On the other hand, directly friendly manifestations were not lacking. On one occasion, I heard a soft sound moving slowly around the room, as if the walls were being lightly tapped with a feather duster, although I could see nothing and was not myself active in the slightest. Another time, a person who happened to be present in my room could hear the same sound just as clearly for several minutes. The following case is also of particular interest. I was looking at a coarse-grained substance lying before me, when, to my greatest surprise, and without my having had the slightest anticipation of it, the substance suddenly began to split slowly into a number of smaller particles. One grain after another seemed to be burst apart by a force acting from within, so that the resulting particles were thrown several decimeters away. After I told an acquaintance about the event, he came to see me some time later to determine whether anything similar could be produced again. I spread the substance upon a sheet of paper and moved several steps away, this time with the vivid wish that the fragmentation would occur again. Before long, the gentleman called out to me that it had already begun once more. After a few minutes, the thought came to me that I ought to interrupt the experiment because of magical overexertion, although I did not consciously feel it as such. I therefore placed the substance, still in the presence of the gentleman, into a glass vessel and closed it with a cork. Even then, the breaking up continued for some time. I had often handled the same substance both before and afterward, but at no other time did it behave in this way. In my judgment, this excluded spontaneous fragmentation caused by internal stresses. In this manner, things continued for years, like a vicious circle, repeatedly enticing, then again hopeless. Hallucinations also began to appear more and more often and more distinctly without any deliberate action on my part, chiefly visual and auditory ones. Over time, they frequently changed to a greater or lesser extent. From their large number, individual hallucinations would for a time, or for longer periods, play a more important role, only to disappear later, and perhaps reappear after weeks or months. Eventually, actual personifications formed. The more important visual images, for example, entered into regular connections with corresponding auditory ideas, so that the appearing figures began to speak and converse with me, to give me advice, and also to produce what I perceived as audible and visible effects at a distance. A highly characteristic and very general defect of these personifications is that they repeatedly take themselves to be in reality what they merely represent or imitate, and therefore speak and act in complete seriousness. For a long time, I have been attempting to develop a number of them further. I will give only a few examples. Several years ago, while observing military exercises, I had repeated opportunities to see a princely personage at close range and to hear him speak. Some time later, I experienced a very distinct hallucination, as though I heard that same person speaking again. At first I paid little attention to the voice, which now appeared from time to time, and it disappeared again for a considerable period. Eventually, however, the feeling arose in me more and more frequently and distinctly that the person in question was near me. The visual image also became clearer, though at first without becoming an actual hallucination. Together with the inner voice, it seemed to force itself upon me of its own accord. Later, personifications of other princely or ruling figures appeared in an analogous manner. especially a personification of the German Kaiser, and also personifications of the dead, for example, Napoleon I. Gradually an unusual and pleasant feeling came over me, a feeling of being ruler and master of a great people. My chest noticeably rose and expanded, almost without conscious participation on my part. My entire posture became strikingly erect and military, which I took as proof that the personification had acquired considerable influence over me. Then I heard the inner voice say, "I am the German Kaiser." After some time I became tired, other ideas forced their way in, and my posture again became less rigid. From the totality of the personifications that arose, the concept I call Highness gradually developed. My Highness has a strong desire to be a distinguished person, especially a princely or ruling personage, or, as I came to understand it more clearly, at least to see and imitate such persons. Highness takes great interest in military displays, aristocratic life, dignified behavior, abundant and refined food and drink, order and elegance in my dwelling, gymnastics, hunting and other sports, travel, fine clothing, and a good, upright military posture. Accordingly, it attempts to influence my way of life by advising, admonishing, commanding, and threatening. By contrast, Highness is an enemy of children, cute things, jokes, and cheerfulness, apparently because it knows princely personalities almost exclusively from their dignified public appearances or from pictures. It is especially hostile to humorous papers containing caricatures, to drinking water, and so forth. In addition, I myself am physically somewhat too small for its taste. Another important role is played by the personification, child. You are Papa. You must play with me. Children's verses are hummed, round and round the little wheel goes, and a little bird comes flying. There is a wonderfully delicate childishness and naively childlike manner, so affecting and touching that in my experience even a real child could scarcely equal it. When I walk through the city, I am urged to stop before shop windows displaying children's toys and study them closely. I am supposed to buy toys, watch children at play, wrestle about on the floor like a child, spin around in circles, in short, to behave in a manner entirely contrary to Highness. Because the further development of such personifications naturally brought with it many opposing demands, and because I did not succeed in reconciling them, or even in keeping them completely separate from one another, the agitation within me increased. New personifications appeared directly against my will, hostile to one another and to me. Eventually, there was often a confused turmoil, and I repeatedly seemed to be in danger of going insane or of suffering some other serious, even life-threatening injury. I was therefore compelled to alter my entire manner of life in important respects. At that point I could indeed recognize with striking clarity that psychologically as well, the human being is anything but a simple unity. Nevertheless, even when a personification acquired considerable influence over my body, particularly over the muscles, it could not overgrow and dominate me completely. This is understandable because in my case, the personification had not arisen as the result of mental illness, but through years of bodily and mental exercise and training. And even when it formed involuntarily, it did so, as it were, only as a side effect of experimentation. I therefore already possessed the necessary general experience and powers of resistance whenever it began to make itself felt in a dangerous way. Furthermore, as soon as a personification attempts, as not infrequently happens, to set itself up as a kind of rival enterprise against me, it immediately finds the entire physical and mental constitution of my own personality opposed to it. During the fiercest struggles, there would therefore often come, all at once, a statement such as, "You are right. I am not really what I would like to be. I was mistaken. You must remind me of that again and again." Although immediately beforehand the voice had cried out to me in nervous excitement, "Not you, I. You are my enemy. You hinder me at every step. You always go somewhere else and do something different from what I want, you old fool." In certain mental illnesses, on the other hand, such as paranoia, personifications of this kind can dominate the conscious ego to a greater or lesser extent. Perhaps at some later time I shall report in greater detail upon the exact course of these lengthy and laborious experiments. To be continued. The Garments of Phantoms, by Joseph Peter, retired colonel. Occult research, the author states, has placed the objective reality of materialization phenomena beyond all doubt. These phantom appearances possess, when the materialization is complete, the full appearance of living reality, and are not to be distinguished from living human beings. Form and clothing alike, he says, are actually present. Their appearance, actions, speech, and so forth resemble those of living people, though only for a short period, after which the phantoms disappear again into a sphere unknown to us. Among these remarkable phenomena, it is particularly the clothing that has aroused the interest of investigators, because, as we shall see, it is said to consist of earthly fabrics. This circumstance defies easy explanation, and naturally gives skepticism a powerful basis for doubt. Yet from the earliest periods of human history down to the present, phantoms have generally been seen in similar rich garments, and, most remarkably, almost without exception, in clothing made from white, fine, muslin-like materials. White garments, Archdeacon Colley is quoted as saying, belong to ghostly appearances throughout the world, and the striking abundance of them in spiritualistic materializations is due to hidden laws that we do not yet know. The Bible itself repeatedly speaks of the white garments in which the redeemed are clothed. They shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. Revelation 3:4. In Matthew 17:2-3, we read that Christ was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. The garments reported in materialization phenomena vary greatly in the fineness and character of their fabric. The covering is sometimes described as so delicate that it can be compared only with a butterfly's wing. In other cases, heavier linen-like fabrics have been reported. Oxacal mentions that in one of Mr. Slater's photographs there appeared a kind of transparent lace, which, on closer examination, seemed to consist of shaded circles of different sizes, wholly unlike any material manufacture. In the overwhelming majority of cases, however, the fabric is compared with fine muslin or soft silk, or is claimed actually to have been identified as such. I have before me 2 specimens of such alleged phantom clothing, and I have carefully examined them. Their history and the results of the examination follow. I must state in advance that the reports, in my judgment, rest upon facts that were established beyond objection, and that even the slightest doubt as to their truth appears excluded. The small piece of cloth represented in the first illustration came from a séance with the famous materialization medium Madame d'Espérance. The owner of the fabric, Max Seiling, retired court counselor and professor, gave the following account. In the clothing of the phantoms, he said, the veil played a prominent part. Frequently it could be seen and felt in actual masses. Not rarely the hands presented by the apparitions were covered with it. During the materialization of a figure, the veil appeared to be the first thing formed and the last to disappear. On one occasion, for example, a shapeless mass about half a meter high was seen outside the cabinet, near the medium. Seiling's wife touched it and found that it felt like veil material. It gradually disappeared again, without a figure ever developing from it. His strongest wish was to possess a piece of these veils, which he said could feel very different from one another, and appeared sometimes black and sometimes white. That wish was finally fulfilled at the last sitting, when, at his request, a figure held out the corner of a veil for him to cut off. On earlier occasions, the request had not been granted, and force had not been used, because the medium had warned that such an attempt might instead cause a garment belonging to the medium, or to one of the sitters, to be pierced. The piece that was finally cut off was a white crepe fabric of the finest kind. A microscopic and chemical examination carried out the following day, Seiling reported, showed that the fabric consisted of genuine silk threads. He added that it had remained unchanged ever since, a point he considered noteworthy because objects obtained at spiritualistic sittings had sometimes allegedly vanished without trace after a period of time. I compared this piece of fabric carefully with several varieties of crepe of the same general type and examined it under the microscope. There can be no doubt, I concluded, that this fabric had passed through a loom and was therefore of earthly manufacture. A curious feature is that it must at some point have become thoroughly wet, or at least damp, because it displays the characteristic mesh pattern of washed crepe. The second specimen was obtained at a sitting with the medium Miss Tamke, and was in the possession of Dr. von Arnhard in Munich. During a sitting he was told through the medium that his mother wished to attempt to appear. Dr. von Arnhard gave the following account. At first, he said, only a shapeless mass of mist appeared at the curtain. Then he was summoned by the waving of a handkerchief to approach the cabinet. By that time, the mist had condensed and changed form. He saw the figure of his mother at her natural height. The resemblance of the forehead, nose, and mouth was striking. The eyes were open, but without expression. He and another man sitting nearby noticed a smell that he described approximately as musty. The figure of his mother extended a hand bearing her wedding ring. He kissed it, but had the impression that it was unusually soft. He experienced the same softness in the lips with which the figure touched him 3 times. He and his wife alternately held the apparition's hands. It yielded somewhat more than the other phantoms when they tried to draw it farther forward. The figure also kissed his wife 3 times, and repeatedly brought either his hand or Helen's hand to its forehead so that they could feel the wrinkles. It resisted his wife's attempts to touch its hair, which, as in life, was white, though it did not seem as pliant and soft as it had been while the woman was alive. Dr. von Arnhard declared that not only the resemblance of the figure, but also its gestures and entire manner compelled him to identify the phantom with his deceased mother. His wife, who had known the deceased, was likewise convinced, as was the wife of Karl Duprel, whose aunt the dead woman had been. The figure beckoned another gentleman to come closer, and allowed him to cut a small piece from the white garment, indicating precisely where it should be cut. Von Arnhard said he still preserved it. The fabric of the head covering appeared to him as fine as a spider's web. The fabric of the dress was unpatterned, coarser, and less splendid than that worn by a phantom which had represented his mother-in-law at an earlier sitting. His mother-in-law had been very concerned with dress during her lifetime, and he observed she had accordingly appeared at the sitting more richly clothed and in finer material than his mother. Perhaps, he suggested, it was only this difference in fabric that made the figure of his mother less luminous. Nevertheless, the features and outline of the apparition could still be clearly recognized. His wife observed that the exposed arm looked exactly like that of an old woman, and was very thin, whereas the medium's arms were more rounded. When attention was called to this, the phantom covered the arm with its sleeve. This second fabric, too, had clearly been woven on a loom. It was a kind of voile. What is especially remarkable, the author writes, is that the phantom was said to have worn an entire dress made of this material, complete with sleeves. Duprel noted in his report on the sittings with Miss Tamke that the fabrics differed in weave and fineness according to the phantom. The phantoms were also draped differently. The head might appear enclosed as if by a bonnet, loosely wrapped or veiled. The sleeves might be tight or wide. Duprel estimated that even at a low estimate, such masquerades would have required about 20 meters of fabric. He argued that anyone who could believe the medium had concealed so much material on her person, or that it had been smuggled into the carefully watched room in which the sitting took place, would not be persuaded by further argument. The medium, he added, had been controlled before the sitting in a manner intended to prevent concealed costume materials. In most cases, the fabrics of the garments are said to disappear together with the phantoms. Light, especially sunlight and intense artificial light, such as a flash, is reported to act destructively upon both the fabric and the entire apparition. The phantoms are described as melting away like snow and ice before the sun. The eyes sink in, the nose disappears, the limbs give way, and the whole figure collapses into itself. Finally, as I myself observed in one case, only the head remains visible upon the floor. At last this too disappears. Nothing remains except a small remnant of clothing, and then that likewise rapidly dissolves into nothing. Dr. Gibier, the author continues, rendered particular service to the investigation of these extraordinary occurrences. The sittings were held in his own laboratory, and the medium was enclosed either in a specially constructed cabinet or in a cage. Before each sitting, the medium and the medium's clothing were carefully examined by the women of Gibier's household. Blue glass was used to reduce the light, and an arrangement was provided for regulating it, which, according to the report, was inaccessible to the medium, but accessible to the phantoms. In short, every precaution was said to have been taken so that the phenomena obtained could be regarded as genuine. From Gibier's accounts, the author selects only those passages relevant to the subject of phantom clothing. At one sitting, a male figure called Ellen appeared, dressed entirely in black, with a white shirt front bearing 2 buttons of the same color. The figure was much taller than the medium and vigorously shook hands with Dr. Gibier and other persons present. At the same sitting, Gibier claimed to have observed the formation of both the phantom and its garments. He described the event as follows. At the lower edge of the cabinet, a white point appeared on the parquet floor. From his position, he could see that it lay approximately 25 centimeters outside the cabinet, away from the curtain. Within 2 or 3 seconds, it became as large as an egg. It moved, he said, like an egg dancing upon a jet of water in a shooting gallery amusement. Then it rapidly lengthened into a column about 1 meter high and 10 centimeters in diameter. It grew to about 1.5 meters, and 2 lateral extensions appeared at the top, giving it the form of a T. It resembled snow, or a dense cloud of water vapor. The 2 arms of the T moved, and a kind of veil appeared to come from them. The object enlarged, and first taking an indistinct form, and then clearly becoming the white figure of a veiled woman. 2 white arms emerged from beneath the veil and threw it back. The veil disappeared, revealing the attractive form of a young, delicate, slender girl about 1.60 meters tall. In a barely audible voice, she gave the name Lucy. She stood for a moment as if allowing the sitters to observe her. Her dress was entirely white. Its broad sleeves were short and reached only to the elbows. Her arms were bare and finely formed. The figure had black hair, arranged on both sides in heavy braids. The medium, by contrast, had short, smoothly dressed blonde hair. The apparition then went to the left end of the semicircle of sitters and bent over a woman identified as Madame D. It took her hands, turned the palms upward, and blew into them. At that moment, as though under the magical influence of the blowing, a flood of lace or tulle appeared to rise from the woman's hands and spread above the heads of those present. At the same time, they heard continuous, regular blowing that seemed, according to the report, to come from a machine or a forge. It lasted at least 30 seconds. The account remarks that a man with powerful lungs could scarcely maintain such blowing for 10 seconds. Madame D said she could feel the breath on her hands and face. The figure took the veil into its hands, raised it over its head, where it seemed to condense, and then spread it outward, until, in Gibier's words, it literally covered us with this cloud. The veils finally disappeared within a few seconds. Immediately after the phenomenon, the medium, who had been tied inside the cabinet, was examined. The medium remained asleep in trance, with saliva covering the mouth and chin. The knots of the restraining cords were reportedly difficult to undo, and the medium emerged pale, covered in perspiration and visibly confused. The detailed reproduction of all the reports would far exceed the space available. I wish only to emphasize, the author says, that in view of Dr. Gibier's honorable character, the unanimous testimony of those present, and the minute and careful controls, every doubt concerning the genuineness of the phenomena must disappear. Moreover, similar events were repeatedly reported in precisely the same manner in different countries and with many different mediums, including some who allegedly had never heard or read descriptions of such phenomena beforehand. Florence Marriott, for example, told of a phantom that moved its hands through the air as though playing with balls. Suddenly a small quantity of muslin appeared in its hands. The figure continued to move it back and forth in the same manner, and before the eyes of the sitters, the material seemed to multiply, until waves of cloth rose in a heap above the phantom's head. At a sitting with the medium Miller, I myself saw a white mass in the form of a small balloon, floating in front of the cabinet, only a few centimeters above the floor. The mass rose to the height of a man, and then sank again. This rising and falling repeated itself, and gradually a white mist-like cloud formed, roughly the height and breadth of a male figure. The movement then stopped, and suddenly, like a flash, a tall male apparition dressed in black stood before us. I shall never forget the sparkling eyes with which the mysterious figure stared at us. Examples of this kind, the author says, can be found in great numbers throughout occult literature. He adds that observers had not succeeded in watching the separate formation of individual body parts or items of clothing. The complete apparition was said to arise in a single process from billowing vapor or a moving whitish mass. The famous medium Madame d'Espérance described the process from her own point of view. The first thing she noticed in the cabinet, she said, was a sensation on her face and hands, as though cobwebs were being drawn across them, causing her to rub her skin. That sensation passed, and she then felt as though the air were filled with material, making it difficult to breathe. When that passed, she knew, she said, that a figure was being built. The cobweb sensation marked the beginning of a manifestation, and ordinarily did not return during the same sitting, unless the process was interrupted, in which case it seemed to begin again. If a little light entered through the curtains, she could see a white, hazy, vaporous mass, moving about like steam from a locomotive. She often put her hand into the haze or vapor to test and feel it, but could never say that it felt as though she had actually touched anything. After the vapor had rolled and moved back and forth for several minutes, or perhaps half an hour, it would suddenly stop, and she would know that a living being was standing beside her. When the vapor transformed into what appeared to be a living being, she could never tell whether the form itself or its covering was made first. The whole change appeared so instantaneous that she could not say what came first, the body or its clothing. A satisfactory explanation of the process of materialization, the article continues, cannot yet be given. The veil over this mystery will be lifted only when the riddle of matter itself has been solved. For the present we must confess, ignoramus, we do not know. And I fear that during our stay in the earthly sphere, we may have to add the famous ignorabimus. The spirit Stafford, who repeatedly appeared at sittings of Madame d'Espérance, is quoted as saying, "You are still standing upon the very lowest rung of the ladder of knowledge." The author also cites words spoken in trance by a Mrs. Richmond during a lecture in London. The surprising thing, she said, was not that so few of these manifestations were satisfactory, but that any succeeded at all, considering the extraordinarily delicate conditions required, and comparing them with the crude, clumsy, and hopelessly material manner in which human beings attempted to investigate them. The substances upon which the spirits were said to act, in order to represent the likeness of a material human body, were described as the most delicate substances the body contains, forming the final connecting link between matter and spirit. Many hypotheses had been proposed to explain these incomprehensible events. Aksakov believed that the materialization of clothing was produced at the expense of some existing object, without that object being completely dematerialized. According to this view, the fabric of the clothing worn by the sitters would serve as the material from which another fabric was formed. The spirit known as Katie was reported to have said that she prepared her covering from material obtained from the garments of everyone sitting in the circle. She also said that when she formed herself, she first materialized this covering and only afterward formed her body. Other alleged intelligences, however, had asserted the opposite, that the figures were materialized first and then clothed in fabric. Aksakov also quoted a communication published in the Spiritualist in 1878. According to it, it was impossible to form such material as phantom clothing unless corresponding material was worn or possessed by the medium or the sitters, because everything in the material world had a corresponding property in the spirit world. White was usually chosen, it said, but if vegetable dyes were placed in the seance room, a spirit might be able to change its white covering into the color of those dyes. Another hypothesis supposed that the fabric of the garment was drawn from the atmosphere, and upon dematerialization, dispersed into the air again. But that still left unexplained the production of genuine woven fabric. The difficulty of constructing a satisfactory hypothesis was illustrated by a prize competition announced by the Occult Review in 1906 for the best solution to the problem of phantom clothing. As might have been expected, no solution emerged, and the entries went no further than incomplete hypotheses. The prize winner, Miss Maud Joint, suggested that thought was the creative force producing objective forms on the astral plane. Certain phantoms might, she proposed, be astral dream forms projected by a deceased person either at the moment of death or later. A very vague conjecture in the author's opinion. The second prize winner, M. Edwin Lucas, likewise offered only a hypothesis, though a more definite one. He pointed to the existence of concentrated gases which in their normal state are invisible and highly volatile. Professor Dewar had shown, he said, that such properties could be changed into solid invisible forms, just as water passes from solid ice to liquid and then to invisible atmospheric vapor. A short reflection, Lucas argued, suggests that all material things may be subject to similar changes, passing from visible into invisible states and back again. The apparently solid universe would then be only a series of condensed atmospheres. On this view, the atmosphere possesses all the properties and qualities of solid Earth. Moreover, invisible emanations are continually passing from every object, moving from the visible into the invisible state. Thus, Lucas concluded, the etheric atmosphere, at its finest degree, might contain a material basis sufficient for the production of every kind of phantom garment. The eminent scientist Sir Oliver Lodge is then quoted. Lodge said that he did not claim to understand materializations, but that if they truly and objectively existed, they might represent a very unusual and surprising modification of some already known vital force. Just as mollusks and crustaceans can draw matter from water and their surroundings to form shells, or to use a closer analogy, just as an animal can assimilate the matter in its food and transform it into muscle, hair, skin, bone, feathers, and so forth. An extraordinarily remarkable process taking place around us every day. So, Lodge said, he could conceive, if sufficiently well attested, that some intelligence or living being ordinarily imperceptible to our senses, though continuously related to what he called our psychical universe, and possessing what might be termed an etheric body, might temporarily make use of particles of earthly matter surrounding it, in order to fashion from them a kind of material covering capable of being perceived by our ordinary senses. The idea, Lodge conceded, was highly improbable, but not inconceivable. The Annals added that Lucas's explanation was neither complete nor exhaustive, but asked what phenomenon we truly understand completely from first principles. If we fully understood even a single phenomenon of the universe, it argued, we would understand the whole universe. It was even possible, the editor suggested, that the subconscious mind, the spirits of the dead, or whatever other mysterious agency might produce materialized phantoms, did not itself know how the process was accomplished. They recalled Alphonse Karr's mocking remark about an inadequate explanation once offered by a member of the Institut de France for table-turning at spiritualistic seances. Would it not have been better, Karr asked, for the man frankly to admit that he understood nothing about it, than to demonstrate that fact by his explanation? The same, the Annals concluded, might still be said of phantom materialization, as indeed of most phenomena in the universe. A spiritualistic imperial speech from the year 574 by Professor Dr. Claus. The history of the Christian Middle Ages is to be learned not only from Latin and Greek writers, but also from more remote sources, including Syriac, Persian, Arabic, and Coptic texts. The first of the Syriac church historians was John of Ephesus, also called John of Asia, who was born at Amida on the Tigris in Mesopotamia around AD 505. In 529, we find him serving as a deacon in a monastery of his homeland, and from 535 onward, in the monastery of the Syrian Monophysites on the Golden Horn at Constantinople. The Emperor Justinian I, in whose special confidence he stood, entrusted him in 546 with the task of increasingly suppressing paganism both in the capital and in Asia Minor. The overseer of the heathen and destroyer of idols devoted himself zealously to this mission, and is said to have baptized no fewer than 70,000 pagans and founded 96 churches. Because in his missionary activity he spared the newly converted Christians, as far as possible, from dogmatic controversies, he incurred the hostility of strict Monophysite Syrians, who after the death of his protector Justinian I in 565 caused him considerable trouble. In 586 he was still alive at an advanced age, apparently then as Bishop of Ephesus. The exact time and place of his death are uncertain. Without being intellectually extraordinary, John nevertheless earned a good literary reputation through his extensive ecclesiastical history, an important source for knowledge of Eastern Christianity, and also valuable for the secular history of the 6th century. Unfortunately, the work survives only in fragments. It originally consisted of 3 parts of 6 books each, and covered the period from Caesar to the year 586. The first part is completely lost. Much of the second was incorporated by the Antiochene patriarch Dionysius of Tel Mare into his own chronicle. The third part, covering the years 536 to 586, survives, though with many gaps. The Syriac text was first edited by W. Curitin at Oxford in 1853, followed by several translations, including a German version by J. M. Schonfelder, published at Munich in 1862. This historian records the following remarkable event. The weak Byzantine Emperor Justin II, who reigned from 565 to 578, and was the nephew and successor of the great Justinian, fell into mental illness in 569, after a life marked, according to the account, by excesses and violence, perhaps aggravated by hereditary predisposition. A painful stone disease accompanied his mental disorder. He spoke incoherently, screamed and howled, made inarticulate animal-like sounds, fell into states of terrified agitation, and alternately tried to hide himself or throw himself from the windows of his palace in Constantinople. In violent fits, he bit and wounded the chamber servants appointed to guard him, so that in the end he had to be bound with ropes. At times he could be calmed by being driven back and forth in a small carriage. Organ music, too, occasionally had a soothing effect. Between such episodes, however, lucid intervals appeared spontaneously, during which Justin II seemed normal and spoke and acted like a rational man. At such times he could walk a little through the city, or receive the homage of the Senate. But before long, he would always fall back into his unhappy condition. The difficult circumstances of the empire, then under severe pressure from the Persians, demanded an energetic and capable man at its head. The Senate therefore consulted the Empress Sophia, and it was decided to propose that the sick emperor appoint a regent as Caesar and successor for the general welfare. During a lucid interval, Justin II, though perhaps hesitantly, was persuaded of the necessity of the measure. He ultimately selected Tiberius, commander of his palace guard, an experienced and capable officer, to serve as regent and successor. On December 6 or 7, 574, the solemn adoption and investiture took place in Constantinople, in the presence of the Patriarch, the Senate, the clergy, the civil authorities, and a great multitude. The remarkable feature of the ceremony was that in this hour of intense emotion, sorrow, and agitation, Justin II was able to speak to both Tiberius and the palace guard in a clear, loud, intelligible voice, interrupted only by weeping and sighing, as though his mind had never been impaired. The beginning of the speech appears to have been transmitted nearly word for word by the historian, something made quite possible by the fact that numerous stenographers reportedly took it down in shorthand. It begins, "My son Tiberius, come and take possession of the rule of the unhappy Justin, who angered God, and whom God in turn has rejected and cast out of this sovereignty while he is still alive. Come here, my son, and drive out the man who despised his Creator, the one who had deemed him worthy of the empire." Seeing himself rejected and deprived of his rule, the emperor began to cry this out loudly before many thousands, so that all who heard him broke into violent weeping and sobbing. He turned and motioned with his hand toward the entire body of soldiers standing there, and said to them in a loud voice, "Open every imperial guard gate to my son, and let all the people come, so that they may see the unhappy Justin stripped and deprived of his sovereignty, because he angered and offended the true king, whose kingdom never passes away, and who, although I was unworthy, raised me to rule." Then he addressed Tiberius. "And now, Tiberius, take me as a terrifying and warning example before the Lord, the eternal King. Fear him, and do not anger him through evil deeds as I angered him by all my works and by my way of life. Therefore all this severe and dreadful punishment has been sent upon me. See, even while I am still alive, I am stripped of and cast out from the government because I came to it unjustly. Take care that this garment and this imperial splendor do not seduce you, as they seduced me, making you proud, deceiving and puffing you up, and bringing the wrath of heaven upon you, as it has upon me, so that you too should be stripped of and deprived of your sovereignty, as I am on this day. See, my son, this one who stands here beside me and tells everything into my ear and teaches me so that I may say to you, teach you, command you, and admonish you. Know, understand, and consider within yourself that what I now speak to you is not mine, but comes from the angel of God. Though neither you nor another may see him, behold, he stands beside me and teaches me everything I speak to you, so that you may be terrified and fear the dreadful sentence of justice that has been passed and executed upon me, as you and everyone can see. Because I did not observe his commandments, behold, he now deprives me of my rule and gives it to you. Look at me, my son, and in me take a warning and terrifying example from the judgment passed upon me. Do not allow yourself to be moved to evil deeds as I was, lest the wrath of heaven also come upon you, as it came upon me, and drive you from your rule. And take care not to obey evil men who counsel evil and seduce you, as they seduced me, so that through all my deeds I angered God. All this and much more was spoken by the emperor in the presence of everyone, with a loud voice and sorrowful tears. Tiberius threw himself sobbing at the emperor's feet, and the whole people and the Senate sobbed with him. They raised Tiberius up, but he again fell upon his face crying. Then all those assembled cried aloud, and no one could restrain his tears. At last Justin made him stand, clothed him with the imperial insignia, and gave him the name Constantinus. Tiberius became Caesar on December 7th, 574. Emperor Justin died on October 5th, 578, after a painful operation for his stone disease, described by the source as a humble penitent for his sins. His successor Tiberius followed him in death in 582. A common monument was erected for the two men, and between them was represented an angel with his mouth placed close to Justin's ear, as though prompting him. John continues that it had been known and certain to everyone that those words had truly been spoken to Justin by the angel of God, and had not come from Justin himself. Another writer who lived much later, Theophanes the Confessor, who died in 817, likewise reports this speech in his Chronographia, without identifying his source. Like John of Ephesus, he seems to have used notes taken by an eyewitness. John gives the speech at greater length than Theophanes, and says Justin spoke considerably more. Theophanes ends it with the words, "May God, creator of heaven and earth, put into your heart everything further that I have forgotten to say to you." In Theophanes, the emperor's speech to Tiberius II consists chiefly of maxims of wisdom and admonitions concerning the welfare of the state. Its line of thought sometimes jumps abruptly, probably because the account is abbreviated. The remarkable statement about the angel survives only in an indirect form. "See how gracious God is toward you, and clothes you with this garment and dignity. God, not I, gives it to you. Honor it, so that you may in turn be honored." In John of Ephesus, the flow of the speech is smoother and more orderly, perhaps because he preserves portions of an actual stenographic record. Its content also differs somewhat, which may be because Theophanes gave greater attention to a second part omitted by John. The only passages that recur in both versions, at least in substance, are Justin's warning to Tiberius not to let the imperial garment tempt him into pride, and his admonition to avoid the evil deeds that Justin himself had committed. From the descriptions of these two writers, Professor Claus concludes that Justin II was a man of mediumistic powers, at times possessed by evil spirits and apparently insane, but at other times protected by a benevolent guardian spirit whose influence the emperor felt during organ music and on other occasions. The believing Syriac historian describes the development of these events in thoroughly spiritualistic terms. According to John, God's justice did not overlook the emperor's shameful acts, but spared him from total destruction by restraining his evil impulses. God therefore sent upon him wrath, anger, and distress through an evil angel who suddenly came, took possession of him, and afflicted him violently and terribly. The emperor suddenly lost his reason. His soul became confused and darkened, and his body was delivered to hidden and visible torments. He made animal sounds, at one moment barking like a dog, at another bleating like a goat, crying like a cat, or crowing like a rooster. The Prince of Darkness, the source says, delivered him over to many acts contrary to all human reason, darkened his face, took possession of him, and caused everything that happened to him. He was driven into agitation and frenzy, rushing wildly from place to place, trying to crawl beneath his bed and fleeing toward the walls. In the end, he had to be bound with ropes. He screamed, howled, and spoke nonsense. This state, John says, lasted not merely days, but nearly 5 years. At one time, Justin looked down toward the seashore and cried out like a street hawker carrying pots for sale. Who buys pots? The prevailing belief, John says, was that God had sent his wrath from heaven for 3 principal reasons. Because Justin had shed innocent blood, because of persecutions of Christians, tortures, oppression, harsh imprisonment, and exile inflicted upon priests, bishops, and the faithful, and finally, because of plunder and seizure of the property of others, including depriving orphans of their inheritance. Professor Claus remarks that this entire description corresponds closely to what spiritualistic literature elsewhere reports concerning possession by evil or low spirits, which are said to seize God-forsaken souls, punish them for their misdeeds, and drive them toward further crimes. Yet the emperor's inward remorse and penitence must also, Claus argues, have been immense to produce so powerful an impression in a public speech delivered before many hundreds of people. He sees the first portion of the speech as revealing a spiritualistic origin even in its wording, because the emperor speaks of himself in the third person, just as many mediums in trance were said to do in the author's own time. Claus therefore interprets the scene as a genuine trance. The inspiring agency identifies itself, as was customary in spiritualistic accounts, as a messenger of God. The second portion of the speech has, in Claus's terminology, a more animistic character, and seems to express the language of Justin's own soul, filled with guilt and acting under the influence of a benevolent spirit that has taken pity on the repentant sinner. Hence the open confession of former sins. The warnings against pride likewise fit the usual tone of such trance speeches. Claus therefore sees no reason to doubt the Syriac historian's words, especially because he believes them corroborated by the later monument depicting the angel at Justin's ear. He concludes that the episode represents a genuine historical trance speech of political importance, scarcely paralleled elsewhere in history. On the Death of William T. Stead, by Ludwig Staudenmaier. I have already told the readers of this journal about my personal relations with this outstanding English journalist, whose earthly career came to an end with the sinking of the Titanic during the night of April 14th to 15th of this year. The memory of those relations may justify my attempting once more to place before the reader an image of the deceased. First, a few words about the outward course of his life. William T. Stead was born in 1849 at Embleton in the English county of Northumberland, the son of a minister of the Independent Church. At the age of 14 he left school and entered a business as an apprentice in the nearby port city of Newcastle upon Tyne. Even in commercial employment, however, his literary inclinations made themselves felt. From time to time the young Stead sent articles to the Northern Echo, the leading newspaper of the district, and the paper printed them. As a result, by the age of 24, he had been appointed its editor-in-chief. In 1880, John Morley, later Lord Morley of Blackburn, and then editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, called Stead to the staff of that London newspaper. Stead later had to assume full direction of the paper when Morley entered upon the political career that was to become so distinguished. In 1890, Stead left the Pall Mall Gazette and founded the illustrated monthly Review of Reviews, which soon gained a large readership and provided him with a substantial income. From 1893 to 1897, in addition to that monthly, Stead published the quarterly Borderland with the assistance of the well-known psychical researcher Miss Goodrich Freer. Borderland covered the broad field of modern psychical research and also discussed the problems of theosophy. Although Stead himself never formally joined the theosophical movement, he always remained, as I have noted previously, on the friendliest terms with its leaders. Borderland, however, did not succeed commercially. The time was not yet ripe for such an undertaking, and despite the enormous success of the Letters from Julia printed in it, Stead was forced to discontinue the journal. These Letters from Julia were, as is well known, a product of his own mediumistic disposition, and in 1909 they also led him to found the Julia Bureau, an enterprise said to have cost him about 15,000 marks each year. The skeptical world poured scorn and ridicule upon this unprecedentedly bold undertaking. Stead was not intimidated. He believed he knew what he was doing. I have already given more detailed information about the Julia Bureau in the earlier issue of this journal mentioned above. There I described the experiences I myself had with the Bureau, though only to the extent permitted by the intimate nature of such experiences. I also noted there that despite the exhausting demands of journalism, Stead still found time, over the years, to publish a considerable series of larger works. Among these works, the pamphlet The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, published in 1885, was perhaps the most meritorious, although it earned Stead much hostility and several weeks in prison. It should also be remembered that Stead was one of the most tireless champions of the cause of peace. Such, in a few strokes, is the outward picture of the life of this man, whom I may perhaps call a hero of the pen, fearless and beyond reproach. His generosity and the high degree of his intelligence, one of his many friends wrote, constantly drove him to take an interest in everything that happens in this world, and also in everything concerning the world beyond. In this extraordinary breadth of interests lay the almost unique character of his personality. One need only pick up almost any English journal from April or May of this year to encounter similar statements. Enthusiastic obituaries devoted to the departed pioneer of spiritualism now fill the columns of the London journal Light, the principal organ of British spiritualists. Among the many associates of Stead, who in the issues of April 27 and May 4, 11 and 18 expressed their warm attachment to their deceased leader, is a name likely familiar to some readers of this journal, Wout Peters. For a time, Peters belonged to the group of sensitives employed by the Julia Bureau. After leaving it, he traveled, including through Germany, where he acquired a certain reputation through his psychometric abilities. In his memorial to Stead, Peters wrote in substance that the end of their friend's earthly career had come suddenly, just as Stead had often said it would. Stead, Peters said, had never expected to die in his bed. He was certain Stead had helped others face death with courage and fearlessness. Peters praised the immense amount of work Stead had accomplished and the influence he had exercised throughout the civilized world. His luminous character, courageous optimism, and unparalleled boldness inspired those who knew him. With his powerful pen, he attacked everything he believed wrong, and inevitably made many enemies, For, Peters wrote, small minds did not understand him. We shall miss the earthly presence and fearless courage of our friend W.T. Stead, Peters continued, but we cannot believe that he will now lead an idle, contemplative existence. He was always a man of work, and will undoubtedly remain so now. As soon as he has overcome the shock connected with leaving the body, he will doubtless continue to serve the cause that was so close to his heart here. These words from a former colleague of Stead lead naturally to the communications published in Light concerning his final moments aboard the Titanic, and the circumstances of his death. These communications did not come, as the reader might assume, from fellow passengers who escaped the sinking ship and were rescued by the Carpathia. Rather, they were presented as messages that appeared to originate from Stead himself, not from Stead while living, but from Stead after he had already passed through the gates of death. They were received by his London friends through mediums shortly after the Titanic disaster. I assume that among the readers of this journal there are some who, like several prominent investigators of the present day, Sir Oliver Lodge, Dr. James Hyslop, Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace, and others, have long since ceased to doubt the possibility of communication with the dead. For such readers, at least, the following alleged postmortem statements of Stead will have interest. Readers accustomed to approaching mediumistic communications with the sharpest criticism, and who see in them nothing more than products of the subliminal consciousness of the medium, remain free to apply that hypothesis here if it seems to them more satisfactory. But first, another matter. One might suppose that a man such as Stead, who claimed to be in communication with the supersensible world, would have been warned from that side if he were about to place himself in mortal danger. It might therefore seem that Stead had received no warning, for otherwise why would he have boarded the doomed ship? Many who learned that the spirit-believing Stead was among the victims probably said to themselves, so much for the help his years of belief in spirits gave him. Why did his supposed spirits not protect him from so terrible an end? It was all childish superstition and nothing more. But can one imagine, for a man of Stead's character, a more fitting death, or a more appropriate conclusion to the drama of his life? Does it not correspond completely with the part he had played as a champion of a spiritual movement for which death had lost its terrors? And what of the supposedly missing warning? When Stead boarded the steamer at Southampton that was to carry him to New York for a peace congress at which he intended to speak, he was filled with a presentiment that something unusual lay before him. One of the last letters he wrote before the Titanic sailed contained these words: I am going to America to make a speech, but I have a feeling as though something lay before me, as though some important work were to fall to me. What it will be, I do not know. I await my marching orders in the secure conviction that he who has called me will make his will and command known to me at the proper time. This was the mood in which Stead began his final voyage. As for the communications already mentioned, what English spiritualists call messages, they are, at least in appearance, messages from the dead. I say in appearance, because the contents and entire form of such messages frequently create the impression that they proceed from definite deceased persons, but not always. At times they seem to originate in the medium's subconscious mind. At other times they appear to be mixtures of different influences. Let us consider one such message that gives the impression of having come from the departed Stead. On the evening of April 21st of this year, exactly 1 week after the sinking of the Titanic, a message was produced through the hand of a female medium at a spiritualist gathering in North London. It began with the name Stead and continued, I am not beneath the waves, I am here, and I rejoice to meet so many old friends here. Although I was warned about the journey, I now know that I had a definite mission to fulfill aboard the Titanic, and I fulfilled that mission. It was very difficult to make the people understand that they had passed into the next world. H. Blackwell, the author of the article in Light, added that after the message had been written, the medium's hand and forearm remained completely stiff and motionless for more than an hour. Blackwell connected this phenomenon with the physical condition in which Stead's body might have been at death. 3 days later, according to the same report, Stead was seen by 2 clairvoyants during a private sitting held in another part of London. This time it was said he had more power at his disposal, and being surrounded only by personal friends, his message, spoken through the mouth of the medium, took on an especially warm tone. I send you all my loving greeting. I am very glad to be among you, so please do not grieve for me, for I am so near to you, and grief would only harm me. Thank God it is all over. I did not suffer. On the contrary, I was in a more exalted mood than ever in my life. I felt a true spiritual impulse. I did not feel myself leave my body at all. How easy it is! I remember jumping from the deck into the water. When I was in the water, I was scarcely conscious of it. I remember only that I reached blindly around me, and something came into my hands, but I endured no suffering. After a few moments of bewilderment, I felt myself free, but I saw myself surrounded by conditions that would have made the heart of the strongest man tremble. In my ears the refrain still sounded, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Yes, that was the hymn I myself had suggested, and which was therefore played aboard during the final moments. Ah, those poor souls who had no idea where they were. I tried immediately to help them. It was difficult work for me, and I have the impression that I shall lead a very active life here. I should like to thank all of you for the great help you have given me since I left my body. I cannot say more. I only wish to ask Mr. Blackwell that I be photographed as soon as possible. So ended the message attributed to Stead. Then came a message attributed to the young musician Brayley, a former member of the ship's band, which had played the hymn mentioned by Stead during the final moments. The message read, "I am Brayley. I am so happy to be with you. I thank God that I had already learned something about these things beforehand. Our beloved Mr. Stead often spoke with many people on board about these matters. Some ladies seemed frightened by the natural way in which he spoke about spirits. He went to bed very late. It was at his suggestion that shortly before the ship sank, we began to play 'Nearer, my God, to thee.' We were spared actual suffering. Only for a few moments did we have to endure the cold. My father had not wanted me to make this voyage, but I thought the journey would be beneficial to me. Now I must say farewell. God bless you. Please let my father know what you have heard from me." The article notes that this young musician was the son of Ronald Brayley, a well-known London medium. A few words then followed that appeared to come from Captain Smith of the Titanic, in which he expressed gratitude towards Stead, who he said had been the first to assist him on the other side. Finally, one of the spirit guides of the circle spoke, and expressed deepest sympathy for all the victims of the tragedy. Of Stead, the guide said, "There was no one else aboard the ship who could perform the task he had to perform there. What is a loss to you is a great gain to us, for he has already accomplished much since he has been with us." So much for these mediumistic communications published in Light. This is not the place to examine in detail whether spoken or written mediumistic statements of this kind can be used to draw secure conclusions about the fate of the human personality after the loss of the physical body. Anyone wishing to study that difficult problem more deeply will find an almost inexhaustible body of material in the continuing publications of the various societies for psychical research. I especially recommend such study to readers who cannot accept communications like those reproduced above as genuine evidence of survival after death. Readers who, like myself, are not inclined to submit such statements to painfully exact psychological analysis, and instead prefer to take them simply in the sense in which their content presents them, will hardly avoid the conclusion that Stead was destined by fate to fulfill an extremely important task in this shipwreck: to prepare his fellow passengers for approaching death through his extensive experience with supersensible matters, and then, after they had passed with him through the gate of death, to open their eyes to the supersensible world that now surrounded them. In my opinion, this is the deeper meaning of all these messages. This, then, was the important work that was to fall to him, the work that already hovered dimly before him when, shortly before the Titanic sailed, he wrote the letter quoted above with such foreboding. And truly, when one surveys Stead's entire life and activity, one may have to admit that no other death would have furnished so fitting and characteristic a conclusion to that life as the moving departure from the stage of life that fell to Stead. The Horoscope of the Titanic by A.J. Pierce. The sinking of the world's largest steamship, the Titanic, at 2:20 in the morning of April 15th, at latitude 41 degrees 16 minutes north and longitude 50 degrees 14 minutes west of Greenwich, with the loss of more than 1,500 lives, deserves to be called the greatest maritime tragedy up to that time. This magnificent vessel, a floating palace, had been regarded and proclaimed as unsinkable. Yet its collision with a massive iceberg at 10:25 in the evening of April 14th opened such a breach that the ship went down 4 hours later. The Titanic was launched at Belfast on May 31, 1911, at 12:15 p.m. according to newspaper reports available to me. This was doubtless Dublin time, and I have corrected it to 12:17:56 mean Belfast time. The configuration of the heavens shows that at that moment and place, Gemini at 13 degrees 46 minutes occupied the upper meridian, while Virgo at 18 degrees 6 minutes was rising. These two signs of the zodiac are mercurial, and the planet Mercury is ruler of the field, while the Sun and Mars are co-rulers. Mars was in decline at 28 degrees 15 minutes of Pisces, and in a semi-square, an angular distance of 45 degrees, to Mercury and Saturn, which were in conjunction in the ninth house, the house governing sea voyages. A more unfortunate time could hardly have been chosen to launch a ship intended to carry thousands of travelers across the Atlantic Ocean. Pierce declares that the neglect of astrology by ship owners, shipbuilders, and directors of shipping companies leads to terrible and unnecessary dangers. Despite repeated warnings addressed to the scientific world and to ship owners by Captain R.J. Morrison between 1831 and 1874, and by Pierce himself between 1861 and 1911, and despite what Pierce regarded as facts and proofs repeatedly demonstrated by both men over a period of 80 years, astrologia sana, sound astrology as Bacon called it, was still despised as mere superstition, while all warnings and instruction were cast aside. Pierce recalled that in the July 1893 issue of Zukunft, he had discussed the fate of HMS Victoria, which was disastrously rammed by Camperdown on June 22, 1893, capsized and sank keel upward within a few minutes to a depth of 70 fathoms. Victoria had been launched at Newcastle upon Tyne on April 9, 1887, at 3:25 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. At a moment when Saturn was approaching the midheaven, the Sun was nearly in conjunction with Mars, and the Moon was in the same declination as the red planet Mars, which Pierce regarded as the principal bringer of misfortune. Pierce further supported his argument by referring to the steel screw steamer Anglia, launched at Glasgow at 2:30 p.m. on October 9, 1888, when, according to his astrological reading, the Sun and Moon were afflicted and Saturn occupied the western angle. He maintained that many other terrible shipwrecks had likewise been shown to have been clearly foreshadowed by the celestial configuration at the time the vessels were launched. Victoria itself had been called an unlucky ship, Pierce observed, even by opponents of astrology. To him, this merely confirmed that if the old knowledge had been investigated and observed, there would have been no reason for a ship to be so burdened by misfortune that it should be destroyed in peacetime, despite all the resources of nautical science and the command of its officers. Many who reject astrology, he continued, too often rush into their own misfortune. To violate the laws of nature by launching ships while malefic planets or stars are dominant is, in his view, virtually to invite disaster and risk delivering passengers and crews into destruction in maritime tragedies such as the sinking of the Titanic. In the second edition of his Textbook of Astrology, published in 1889 and again in 1911, Pierce said he had provided instructions for finding good and favorable times to begin building a ship and to launch it. For passenger vessels, for example, he recommended that Mercury be well aspected by Jupiter or Venus in the 10th house, and that the Moon likewise receive favorable aspects from those benefic planets while remaining free from affliction, as should the ascendant. An examination of the Titanic's horoscope, Pierce argued, showed Mercury in the 9th house in conjunction with the malefic Saturn and in semi-square to Mars, without a favorable aspect from Jupiter or Venus. The descendant was strongly afflicted by the presence of Mars, while the moon received no friendly aspect from Jupiter. The moon had already passed its conjunction with Venus, and was approaching exact opposition to Uranus. How much longer, Pierce asked, will prejudice be allowed to prevent the scholars of the 20th century from making this magnificent application of useful astrology? He closed by invoking the proverb attributed to Solomon: "The wise man foresees evil and protects himself. The fool passes on and suffers the penalty." Pierce argued that governments were willing to support meteorological institutes in order to preserve life through storm warnings, yet ignored what he regarded as the vital importance of reducing maritime disasters by consulting the accumulated experience of astrology, and requiring shipbuilders and ship owners to ask specialists for favorable times before construction and launching. Are the Prophecies of Sibyls and Clairvoyance True? By Carl Heise. In the January issue of the Zentralblatt, I added to the many predictions published elsewhere about the future of our planet 2 forecasts from Professor Rex Roy in London and Mrs. von Heyman in Bremen, both of which also concern Germany. Both had predicted the already realized increase in the strength of the Social Democrats. I had not specifically reported this point regarding Mrs. von Heyman, but she had forecast both the rise of social democracy and the decline of the Center Party to fewer than 100 deputies in the Reichstag. She had also given special importance to Kaiser Wilhelm as an intellectual co-director of destiny. More recently, the French Major de Civrier entered the field and proclaimed the complete downfall of Germany at the hands of the combined powers of France, England, Belgium, and Holland, through a total defeat of German troops on a place called the Birkenfeld, literally the Birch Field. Despite extensive inquiry, I have unfortunately been unable to determine the occult background of this prophecy by the French chauvinist de Civrier. Yet because behind everything physical, even behind that which is only thought, there stands something spiritual, whether one calls it the Platonic world of ideas or the theosophical forms in the Akashic Chronicle, it is clear to me that de Civrier must at least have received his predictions through guiding elemental beings. For our ordinary physical and psychic perception, such beings belong to the Akashic or spiritual underworlds or higher worlds. As I have said, I cannot directly investigate de Civrier's prophecy. At the suggestion of our esteemed editor, however, I have at least gathered some interesting notes concerning the Birkenfeld, upon which Germany is supposedly to be destroyed. It seems to me, first of all, that de Civrier did not focus his telescope into the astral worlds precisely enough, so that he himself does not know which Birkenfeld is meant. There are countless places of that name, and in the author's interpretation, all have occult significance. The word birch, Old Germanic biark, is said here to signify enclosed, rising life, and for that reason the birch was regarded in ancient times, as it still was in certain modern circles of magicians or initiates, as a symbol for the exercise of a particular magical power. If de Civrier truly obtained a glimpse into the subconscious or superconscious processes of the coming future, Heise reasons, then the supposed downfall of Germany would have to occur through a magical act of will, by powerful enemies united against Germany, even if only at the level of intended will action. Heise declares that Germany is the most isolated of the European states, and the most hated member of the political organism. The German abroad, who truly feels Teutsch, that is, Teutonic, from Teuto, whom Heise calls the spiritual guide of the German character, encounters this hostility at every step. Why, he asks, should the demonic helpers of the enemies of what he calls Areo-Germania hesitate to overcome Germany by magical means? Especially since many lines of the German high and sword nobility had, in his view, forgotten their spiritual duties through centuries of mixed marriages. So the birch and the Birkenfeld. Among the ancient Germanic ancestors, the birch was considered especially healing. Heise connects this with the old legend that on the Birkenfeld, the old Barbarossa would reappear and restore Germany to health, leading it again toward rising life. He also presents the birch as ancient and native to European Germanic soil. In the glacial moraine landscapes of Bavaria, he says, large former birch forests had been uncovered, and from primeval times the birch had been sacred to Europeans, particularly Germanic peoples. He lists numerous place names derived from birch: Birkenwerder, near Berlin; Birkenau in the Odenwald and in the Marienwerder district; Birk in Upper Franconia; Birkenhain in Bromberg; Birkenwald in Alsace-Lorraine and the Gumbinnen district; and many places called Birkenfeld or Birkenfelde in Franconia, Saarbrücken, Oldenburg, East Prussia, Thuringia, Posen, Westphalia, Austria, and elsewhere. Wherever such names occur, Heise claims, one encounters an old Germanic cult site, supposedly presided over by the Almans, Alachmannen, or priests and temple lords, and often associated with an ancient thing, assembly place, or Vem court. Birch sap, he says, supplied a German soma drink for the cult, comparable in his interpretation with the Vedic soma of India and the homa of the Parsis. In Christian times, birchwood was later used to make witches' brooms, which he connects polemically with attempts to drive out the old heathens devoted to the cult of Wotan. The widespread birch cult was also expressed, he says, in the raising of great birch or May trees at Maytime and Pentecost, around which young people danced as a sign of reawakened vitality. And it is upon such a birch field, Heise exclaims, that the French major wishes to see Germany's youthful strength destroyed. Dr. Winterstein of Kassel had written to Heise that the Birkenfeld mentioned by Major de Civrio might be a location separating regions in Westphalia and the Sauerland, not far, in symbolic geography, from the legendary Kyffhauser world in Thuringia, where Emperor Redbeard, Barbarossa, is said to sit enchanted in an underground castle. Such a place would also lie along a conceivable line of military action for French, Belgian, Dutch, and British forces. Guido von List in Vienna, however, disagreed with the newspapers that had reacted indignantly to de Civrio and his prophecy. List believed the chosen Birkenfeld should be sought in Upper Austria on the so-called Walser or Welser Heath. He interpreted this as a heathland or sunland of the old Germanic peoples. For this Walser Heath, as for all birch fields understood as cult places with birch groves, List invoked a spiritual symbolism in which Emperor Redbeard served as a synonym for Wotan, whom he regarded as the spiritual leader of the Teutonic race. According to the esoteric racial doctrine cited by Heise, all races were thought to stand under hierarchies or pyramids of spiritual beings, each led by a high spirit, angel, or archangel. In this system, Germania's ruling spiritual being was identified with Wotan Tut and symbolically with Emperor Barbarossa. The legend says that after his final battle, Barbarossa will hang his shield and sword upon a withered pear tree, or perhaps, Heise suggests, originally a birch tree, which will immediately blossom, grow green, and bear fruit. Von List wrote that the mythical Walser Heath was identified with the actual Welser Heath near Wels in Upper Austria, where a withered pear tree stood and was regarded as sacred. Remarkably, he claimed, in 1871, after the peace following Sedan, this dead tree began to grow green and blossom again. In this Welser or Walser Heath symbolism, von List argued, the Germanic side triumphs over the Romance-Celtic alliance, mixed with British or Anglo-Saxon blood, not the reverse. If Wotan hangs up his weapons after his final struggle, it could not, in this interpretation, signify a victory of the kind predicted by the French major. The alleged blossoming of the pear tree after 1870 was presented as confirmation, although Heise admitted that he had been unable to discover whether the tree was still alive and leafy in 1912. His inquiry to Wells had not yet produced an answer, and von List could not tell him either. Heise considered it important for occult research to determine whether the Welser pear tree had perhaps died again, which might then be interpreted as confirmation of Major Civrio's ominous sign. The fact that the birch tree of the original birch field had become a pear tree in the Wells symbolism did not seem important to Heise. Ancient Germanic peoples, he said, regarded all trees as sacred, though the pear tree became a cult tree only in a later period. It then took the place of the birch, while pear cider or pear mead replaced the birch soma. Heise even points to a Bavarian drink of pear juice mixed with honey as a survival of this tradition. In Christian times, he says, pear trees were often planted where birches had previously stood, transferring the cult to a fruit tree adopted during the migrations of peoples. Assemblies and court sessions could then take place at a meeting site shaded by a pear tree. So much for the symbolic treatment of the prophecy. Heise then asks whether the many sibyls and prophets of disaster might nevertheless be right when they proclaim Germany's fall almost with one voice. He begins by noting that several other points in Professor Roxroy's predictions concerning world events had already seemed strikingly accurate to him. In August 1911, Roxroy had astrologically predicted labor unrest in England for 1912. Agitation over Irish Home Rule had begun. Diplomats everywhere had been and remained uneasy, and deaths had occurred among prominent persons. Lord Lister had died, and the Titanic disaster had taken the lives of the millionaire Astor and the world-famous spiritualist William Stead, often mentioned in the Zentralblatt, author of many ethical and intellectual writings, and founder of the spiritualistic Julia Bureau. Heise therefore considered it possible that other portions of these predictions might yet be fulfilled. Mrs. von Heyman had predicted German complications with England. Heise then cites General of Cavaliers Friedrich von Bernhardi, writing from Tsingtao in the newspaper Post. Bernhardi recalled that during the Morocco negotiations, Germany had at one point stood close to war with England. British warships appeared off Kiautschou Bay, full prepared, he said, to attack the German colony in China immediately if relations between the two states broke down. Later indiscretions by British officers were said to have removed any doubt that the ships had been waiting only for a telegraphic signal from London to open fire. By contrast, Bernhardi claimed, the German administration at Tsingtao had apparently not even been informed of the seriousness of the situation, so a surprise attack might have succeeded. Bernhardi wrote that relations with England had changed little. In the Far East, he said, the tension was immediately perceptible and gave the impression that conflict over Germany's position as a world power would eventually come. He accused Japan, allied with Britain, of supporting Chinese unrest, supplying arms to revolutionaries, and encouraging anti-foreign interests. At the same time, he said, Tsingtao was inadequately protected. Because of insufficient fortification, German Tsingtao would lose its value as a naval base in wartime. The shipyard and floating dock, which had cost millions, would be exposed to destruction by artillery. No ship could safely remain in the harbor. The city and small harbor could also be shelled from nearby heights at a range of about 3,000 meters. In the event of war with England, Bernhardi thought it highly probable, because of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, that Japan would attack Germany's Asian possession. Heise then turns to the organization of reserve formations in the mass armies of Europe. Citing a publication of the German Defense League, he says France had considerably surpassed Germany in preparedness. The opening period of a war, the source argued, was decisive, and France could now begin a war against Germany with numerical superiority, even though the French Republic had 26 million fewer inhabitants. Heise links this statement to earlier prophecies printed in the Zentralblatt that claimed the French would take the offensive against Germany in 1913 and enter Mulhouse in Alsace. Germany, he adds, had reached this unfavorable position despite enormous military expenditure. Citing a Peace Association lecture in Lucerne, he says Germany spent some 1.7 billion francs annually on its military, devoting roughly 20 parts to army and navy for every 1 part devoted to general public welfare. The future, Heise concludes, will teach how events turn out. If Germany became conscious of the slogan Aryan blood, highest good, he believed the final outcome would scarcely be doubtful, even if the country initially suffered painful experiences. But he laments, the German whistles at the occultists who warn him. Proven methods of healing snakebite and the bites of rabid animals, collected and communicated by G.W. Surya. Continued. The text resumes with a defense of a so-called miraculous oil against imitators and chemical analyses. Its advocate complains that speculative quacks and supposed men of science have repeatedly examined and copied the oil, producing substitutes that were often harmful. Speaking as a layman, he refuses to judge the full range of chemical art, but mocks the contradictory certainty with which different investigators announce incompatible formulas. One analyst, he says, declares that oleum baunscheidt consists, according to scientific analysis, of poppy oil, rapeseed oil, and extracted Spanish flies. Another claims that thorough scientific investigation reveals poisonous croton oil as the active ingredient. A third identifies tartar emetic and veratrine as the additives responsible for the oil's skin-irritating effect. A fourth, and countless others, arrive at still different results from their strictly scientific investigations. To all these mutually contradictory scientific pronouncements, the writer complains. Unfortunate and often badly represented science is somehow expected to say yes. But I, Baunscheidt, say no, the text continues. Baunscheidt openly declares that science has once again missed the mark, although every marksman claims to have hit the center. All imitations of the oil, he says, are ineffective or harmful, first damaging the principal organ and gradually the whole organism. According to his experience, they especially produce chronic skin eruptions, whereas genuine oleum baunscheidt was claimed to cure them. Dr. C.H. Schauenberg of Godesberg, formerly a professor at the University of Bonn, had, the article says, seriously studied Baunscheidt's method, and had seen a considerable number of illnesses considered incurable improve within a relatively short time under the treatment. On March 15, 1861, Schauenberg certified 3 points: that correct use of the so-called Lebenswecker, or life awakener, could cause no injury to healthy or sick persons. Second, that when appropriately used it could, in many illnesses, have an undeniably favorable effect. And third, that the so-called oleum baunscheidt, whose ingredients and method of preparation he knew from a formula supplied by the ministry, contained none of the substances officially designated as poisonous. A plant mucilage, once included in the oil, had, he said, been omitted after the ministry declared that ingredient inadmissible. Schauenberg later had an oil made according to his own specifications for use in Baunscheidt treatment. It was marketed as oleum exanthematicum, the analytical chemical laboratory of Dr. Surya. Theobald Werner in Breslau reported that the oil contained organic fatty substances dissolved in a fine vegetable oil, which, when properly introduced into the human skin or epidermis, produced a secretion or eruption upon the skin, without pain or appreciable inflammation. The report said that the relevant property of the oil's principal constituent had long been known to science, while the method of application and the composition of the oil were credited to Schauenberg. It further stated that the oil was free from metallic and narcotic substances, and when correctly used, reliably produced its intended effect. From this, the writer concludes that genuine oleum baunscheidt, and probably Schauenberg's oleum exanthematicum as well, contained no croton oil, despite claims to the contrary that still circulated. The article expresses surprise that Dr. W. Klimaszewski's otherwise respected book, Meine Kräuterkur, printed a formula for Baunscheidt excretory oil containing pure croton oil, caustic ammonia, and water. The writer says any conscientious pharmacist would rightly object to such a formula and warn against its use. The discussion of composition is lengthy because, the author explains, contradictory claims about the active ingredients had helped bring Baunscheidtism into disrepute. The article then directs interested readers to a specialist institute in Leipzig that sold both the purported genuine oleum baunscheidt and Schauenberg's oleum exanthematicum. The author considers it a duty to call public attention to what he describes as a simple and effective healing system, valued not only as a specific remedy for snakebite, but as a broadly useful household treatment, especially for isolated rural families far from rapid medical aid. The article next turns to other remedies historically recommended against snakebite. Dr. Zimpel's Medizinischer Hausschatz is quoted as describing a 10-year-old girl who had become cold after a viper bite and was said to have been saved by external and internal use of chlorine water, then called aqua oxymuriatica. Concentrated solution was placed on the wound in compresses, and a diluted solution was administered internally at intervals. The writer then closes this portion of the discussion of unusual snakebite remedies with a story that he says no longer belongs to ordinary medicine, and might more properly be called a magical healing. The Kölnische Zeitung of January 7, 1912, had printed the account under the title, The Snake Charmer. Although the names of the principal participants were unfortunately omitted, the journal considered the story worth preserving because similar strange accounts had been reported by other travelers and occultists. The scene was the island of Java. The narrator and eyewitness was a German. His friend was of mixed European and local ancestry. Accompanied by several porters, the two went hunting wild boar. The relevant part of the story begins after the hunt. We could be satisfied with the result of our hunting and started home. The porters had heard our shots and were already coming to meet us. My friend was in high spirits and was telling several hunting stories. Meanwhile, we had reached the footpath running along the edge of the forest, when my friend suddenly broke off in the middle of a sentence and sprang aside with a cry. At the same time, I thought I heard a rustling in the leaves. At first I did not know what had happened, and turned toward my friend. His appearance filled me with terror. His face was chalk white, his staring eyes seemed about to leap from their sockets, and his whole body trembled like an aspen leaf. Only the fear of death can produce such terror. For God's sake, what has happened? A snake. Here, in the right shoulder. He named the snake, though I have since forgotten the name. I knew, however, that it was one of the most dangerous, and that its bite was believed to be fatal. It was impossible to bind off the wound. Helpless, I stood in the lonely, silent wilderness, beside a man who seemed slowly to be dying, among a foreign people whose language I scarcely understood. Then an idea occurred to me. "Stay here, I will fetch the porters," I called to my friend, and ran back as quickly as possible. Fortunately, I met the porters already returning. The game that had delighted us only a short time before was thrown carelessly aside, and we ran back to the injured man. Here I again had occasion to admire the practical skill of the local people. In a moment they had made a stretcher from several cut bamboo poles. A few spare articles of clothing were laid upon it, and my friend was placed on this bed. Then we set off at the quick, short-stepped pace the porters use when carrying heavy loads. A third porter had run ahead. During a rest, the injured man confessed that he had sent him to a snake charmer who lived nearby, and who he believed was now the only person capable of saving him from certain death. The German narrator says a skeptical remark was on his lips, but because he knew the local population's beliefs well enough, he kept silent. Why rob his friend of his last hope? At the time, he found it incomprehensible that the man expected salvation from a local healer, when in the narrator's view, even the best European physician could no longer help him. At last they reached the hut of one of the porters. To be continued. Occult Review: A Miraculous Healing. The London Daily Chronicle, described by the Zentralblatt as a highly serious newspaper, had published a sensational account several months earlier concerning the sudden recovery of a young woman believed to be dying. The report was acknowledged to be difficult for skeptics to accept, although the newspaper declared itself responsible for the accuracy of its information. According to the account, 5 years earlier, the then 17-year-old Miss Dorothy Karen, whose parents lived at 204 Milkwood Road in London, had been suffering severely from pulmonary tuberculosis, and was taken to a tuberculosis home at Reading. After 9 months, she had also developed what the report called severe anemia and diabetes, and was sent home as incurable. Several hospitals refused to admit her until she eventually found refuge in St. Peter's Home for Incurables at Kilburn. When she appeared close to death, she was taken home by ambulance, where death was expected at any hour. That had been 2 years earlier, and since then Miss Karen had reportedly not left her sickbed. 2 weeks before the event described, she became deaf and blind. On the following Saturday, the family physician said he did not expect her to survive the night. She was unconscious. Her pulse could scarcely be felt, and the usual signs of approaching death were said to be present. Around midnight, her mother, weeping beside the bed, heard her daughter whisper words to the effect that Jesus was coming, and that a great miracle would occur. In the early morning hours, the young woman sat upright in bed, for the first time in many months, looked at her mother, and said, "A voice from above called to me, 'Dorothy, your sufferings are over. Rise, leave your bed.'" She immediately asked her mother for her clothes, and announced that she intended to get up. Her terrified mother insisted that she was delirious with fever and must remain calm. Instead, the patient reportedly sprang from the bed, walked barefoot around the room, and then dressed herself steadily and calmly. At noon, relatives arrived expecting to learn whether Dorothy had died. They were astonished when Dorothy herself opened the door and warmly greeted them. When a Daily Chronicle reporter visited the Milkwood Road house, he found what he described as a touching family scene. Dorothy was surrounded by parents, siblings, and relatives who repeatedly broke into tears of emotion over the event. The journalist described her as a beautiful young woman with large blue eyes and a gentle, friendly smile. Dorothy told him, "Suddenly I saw a strong, wonderful beam of light shining down upon me. And from an immeasurable distance, I heard a voice say, 'Dorothy, your sufferings are over. Rise, leave your bed.' At the same time, I felt two gentle hands touch me. First, they clasped my right hand, then passed over my eyes and disappeared again. At that same moment, my sight returned, and I felt an uncontrollable joy and strength within me. I was driven to leave that dreadful sickbed immediately. Since then, I have felt completely well and healthy." The article emphasizes that the Karen family physician was a reputable practitioner, well known in the district, and also serving as a justice of the peace. The Daily Chronicle reporter went to see him at once. The doctor said, "On Saturday evening, I left the girl in a dying condition. When I was told on Sunday that Dorothy had got up and gone for a walk, of course, I did not believe it. I hurried to her parents and nearly fell over from shock when the girl came toward me." The physician confirmed, according to the report, that Dorothy Karen had suffered for 5 years from very advanced pulmonary tuberculosis, diabetes, and severe anemia. Asked what he thought had caused the sudden recovery, the doctor answered, "I have no explanation. Had I read this story in the newspapers, I would have regarded it as a crude fraud. Dorothy Karen is healthy today. How she became so, I have no idea." The Zentralblatt's commentator argues that anyone unable to believe in miracles will naturally explain such an event through autosuggestion, imagination, or similar concepts. Yet the writer says even such a scientific explanation would amount to an admission that mental forces can exert extraordinary effects upon the material body. In the author's view, cases of this kind push a purely materialistic worldview into the background. A single proven instance of a miraculous healing, he argues, could become a turning point in the inner lives of thousands. If events still occurred that a modern physician could not explain, he asks, why must the miraculous healings of the Bible be treated merely as legends? If even a visionary appearance of Christ could, in the author's interpretation, free a person believed hopelessly near death from illness in a single moment, and fill her with uncontrollable joy and strength, then why, he asks, should Christ, while living on earth, not also have performed healings that could properly be called miraculous? Spiritualistic reports concerning the Titanic disaster. A report from New York stated that a non-professional medium, Mrs. de Meisner, daughter of the late American Rear Admiral Radford and widow of a legation secretary who had died in Switzerland 16 years earlier, transmitted to President Taft a message said to come from his military aide, Major Archibald Butt, who died in the Titanic disaster. Mrs. de Meisner stated that she received the communication on April 18th, several hours before the Carpathia established wireless contact with New York. At that time, the president was said to be deeply concerned about the still uncertain fate of his aide. The message read in substance, "I very much wish to speak with someone in the world. I wish to send a message to the president. I mean, Taft. I have never felt so free and inexpressibly happy as at this moment. All my worries have fallen away from me. I am only glad that I was able to do a little to help those who are so terribly frightened. I wish I could have done more. Mrs. de Meissner also claimed to have received messages from the well-known peace advocate William Stead and from Mrs. Isidore Strauss, the latter likewise describing the blessedness of her new existence. Mrs. de Meissner said that she had never taken part in a spiritualist séance, the Fakir's trial by fire. An Indian judge, Abu Prankumar Ghosh, gave in an Indian periodical a vivid description of what was presented as a fakir's wonder. The disciples of the holy man dug a trench in the ground about 20 centimeters deep and 4 meters long, filled it with combustible material, and set it alight. After the fire had burned for an hour and a half, the fuel was glowing intensely, and the heat was said to be so great that spectators could scarcely approach within 5 meters. Suddenly, the fakir appeared. For a short time he stood before the fire, staring steadily into the flames. Then, singing in an unusual manner, he stepped into the burning bed. Flames immediately rose around him to the hips. The whole assembly, Ghosh wrote, was deeply affected by the ghostly sight. 4 times the fakir crossed the fire in each direction. Finally, he walked out with dignity and, according to the report, uninjured. His disciples cleaned his feet and then repeated the same performance. The holy man invited everyone present to attempt the fire ordeal as well. Ghosh and several friends came forward and said they were willing. The fakir approached and touched the head of each man with his hand. We felt, Ghosh reported, a shudder pass through us. A feeling of inexpressible joy entered us and compelled us, almost without conscious intention, to step into the fire. We crossed it 2 or 3 times. It was wonderful. It seemed as though the fire had lost its power. We stood in the middle of the same glowing bed whose heat had been unbearable to us at a distance of 5 meters. Yet the burning power of the fire had by no means disappeared. My friend threw a scrap of paper into the flames, and it was consumed immediately. The Zentralblatt found this description especially interesting because the fakir was said to have transmitted his mystical power to Europeans through the laying on of hands. The shudder they felt when his hand touched their heads might, the commentator concedes, be explained by excitement. The second sensation, however, a feeling of inexpressible joy entered us, is treated as more significant since none of the Europeans could supposedly have anticipated it. The writer connects this inexpressible joy with an experience often described by yogis and saints as an attribute of the awakening or inflow of higher spiritual forces within the human being. Christian mystics, he says, call it heavenly peace and blessedness experienced when the soul becomes one with its origin. The Indian yogi, in the terminology used by the article, calls the corresponding state being knowledge bliss. According to such accounts, this bliss is said to surpass all the pleasures and delights of the external world. The spiritual center of the soul is therefore presented not as an imaginary empty point, but as the primal source of inexpressible joy. Under the spell of hypnosis. The Neue Wiener Journal reported on April 6 of that year concerning a sensational legal case involving Siegmund Versbach, Reichsritter von Hadamar, a senior official of the Prague State Railway Directorate. Versbach had already appeared before a Prague court on charges of falsifying titles of nobility. He was now taken into custody and transferred to the Czech psychiatric clinic. The arrest was reportedly ordered because delegates of the Czech medical faculty, who were preparing an expert opinion, believed that experiments performed on Versbach by his private physician were complicating the investigation. Versbach's defense attorney, Dr. Buchek, criticized the measure. He said the faculty commission, consisting of Professors Kufiner and Heverock and lecturer Jansky, had summoned Versbach on March 30, and had already hinted at that first examination that detention was being considered. Versbach was now housed, the attorney complained, with other psychiatric patients in a small, unpleasant-smelling room at the clinic. Buchek found the professor's conduct highly peculiar, and said he had filed a complaint against them with the Academic Senate of the Czech University. Dr. Wiener, Versbach's attending physician, had hypnotized him before the court, and later conducted further hypnotic seances. Wiener agreed that so complicated a case should be examined in a clinic under appropriate precautions, but rejected the idea that this justified treating Versbach as a prisoner. His experiments, he said, had been conducted only before specialists of the medical faculty, and were intended to record graphically post-hypnotic skin changes and the pulse during trance, hypnosis, and the waking state. He said he sought scientific evidence for his view that Versbach had committed the alleged falsifications of noble status while under the influence of hypnosis. Occultism in the light of monistic wisdom. Dr. Richard Henning of Berlin recently spoke on this subject before the Hamburg branch of the German Monist League. The concept of occultism, he said, is fluid. Some things regarded several hundred years ago as scientific subjects are now treated by us as occult problems. Conversely, many things once considered occult have since been clarified by natural science. Occultism, in the narrower sense, Hennig argued, concerns especially the problem of mental or soul life. Alongside difficult psychological questions, self-deception occurs. Astrology, palmistry, much traditional folk superstition, and a large part of spiritualism should, in his judgment, be classified as pure superstition. Self-deception, however, plays a more important role in occultism than deliberate fraud. Modern psychological research, he continues, teaches us that the human being has a tendency to interpret blurred visual impressions in fantastic forms. This general human tendency, Hennig argued, plays its most important role in darkness. The superstitious person does not think of investigating the problem thoroughly. The critically minded person turns on the light and discovers the error. It was no accident that places with sinister reputations, such as cemeteries and execution grounds, were regarded as breeding places for ghosts and spirits. Heightened expectation and fear produce the perceptions. A large part of human divination, he continued, rests on the tendency to see shapes in ambiguous things. The same applies to the subject of Ode, the supposed radiations seen above graves. These, he said, had long since been recognized as illusion. In the darkness of spiritualist sittings, human imagination could run riot. Figures appearing there would be interpreted differently by different observers. Each person sees what he wishes and expects to see. Hallucinations appear especially in persons who have passed through depression. People divided against themselves may even see their own form. Goethe, Hennig noted, reported seeing his double after his separation from Friedrich Brion. Human expectation had, in Hennig's view, produced a whole range of occult phenomena that were then interpreted more or less spiritistically. Table turning was one example. A person expecting movement thinks about it so intensely that without conscious participation, he himself performs the movement in its rough outlines. We can now state with confidence, Hennig said, that human beings themselves produce certain things that appear to have been communicated by a supernatural being. Closely connected with this are spiritualist conversations with the spirit world and automatic writing, which he placed within the psychology of expected movement. He also considered the psychological side of the much-debated divining rod to be solved, though he regarded its physical side as still uncertain. The rod itself, he said, was separate from the possibility that sensitive persons might, in some unexplained manner, register the presence of underground water through their nerves. Suggestion, to which every person is subjected hour after hour, was responsible for many occult questions. In earlier times, belief in the possibility of enchantment could produce sensations that gave a person the feeling that the enchantment had actually succeeded. On the other hand, suggestion could also beneficially influence the mental side of a person. Hennig placed miraculous healing and healing by prayer in this category. Important psychiatrists, he said, had taken the view that belief in relics and similar objects might under some circumstances help the patient more than medical skill. A large number of occult phenomena, he continued, could be traced to hysteria. Somnambulism was one example. During deep sleep, a person could perform familiar actions. The old tale of the Heinzelmännchen, little household spirits that secretly did people's work during the night, was interpreted as a folk memory of unconscious work performed by human beings in somnambulistic states. Dreams of flying, commonly associated in the Middle Ages with witches' ointments, were attributed to poisoning with henbane, described as an important ingredient in such ointments, and capable of producing strange, predominantly erotic sensations. Hennig nevertheless acknowledged that some occult questions remained unsolved, including presentiments and clairvoyance. Using a series of projected images, Hennig showed how celestial phenomena at all periods had produced ghostly impressions, as had unfamiliar animals. Human expectation, he said, constructs resemblances in many things. He concluded with a longer discussion of painting and writing mediums. The actress's vision. A report from Copenhagen dated April 6 recalled the great sensation caused in Nordic theatrical circles 2 years earlier when Anna Larsen, described as Copenhagen's most gifted and beautiful actress, suddenly refused on religious grounds ever again to appear on the stage. The decision seemed especially surprising because she had previously belonged to the city's liveliest social circles and was among the last people anyone expected to develop religious scruples. For a long time, people hoped that her decision was merely the result of a nervous illness and that after recovery, her considerable talent would return to the Copenhagen theater. They were mistaken. Larsen's conversion proved lasting, and the theatrical world had now accepted that she would never return to the stage. She joined a religious healing sect, lived in strict asceticism, and appeared before the public only as a speaker at religious meeting halls. In her addresses, she spoke with enthusiasm and joy of the salvation she believed she had found. She frequently expressed the hope that her earnest prayers might also rescue her many former friends in the colorful world of the theater from what she now called their sinful way of life. The case was compared with the religious experience of Hedwig Wangel, still well remembered in Berlin. Because Larsen's changed worldview and religious mood had persisted so strongly, the report said, one could scarcely doubt the sincerity of her feelings. The paper Politiken asked her about the event, and she stated that a peculiar dream experience, a vision, had decisively influenced her conversion. Larsen described the vision approximately as follows. I was lifted from the earth very gently, very slowly. As I continued to rise, I saw a snowy landscape below me. Snow fell in soft, thick flakes and settled gently and silently on the roof of the village church and the little houses around it. The bells rang through the winter air, but their sound was faint. Everything was so gloomy, and I felt oppressed, yet at the same time joyfully expectant. I continued rising, carried upward by something invisible, until I glided quietly into an immense boundless space. I entered it in a reclining position. A man glided toward me. I became completely convinced that I would see this man again after I died. It was as though a gray spiderweb covered his entire person. His face was gray and covered with beard stubble. His clothing was made of gray cloth, and a rope was tied around his body. I felt that he was neither redeemed nor lost, but existed in an intermediate condition. His nature was somehow double. He despised God and feared God at the same time. He passed his hands over my face, and at that same moment I saw 2 female figures behind him rocking a cradle. From the foot of the cradle came a melody that I cannot forget. Later I once heard several bars resembling it in a nocturne by Chopin, and an icy wave passed through me. The strange gray man looked at me. He did not want me to learn anything, but a mysterious power compelled him. A peculiar expression appeared around his mouth, frightened and mocking at the same time. He slowly turned toward the woman sitting on the left and asked her a question, so softly that I could not hear the words. Immediately the cradle stopped, the music ceased, and she lowered her head in shame. I looked again at his face. It was dark and bitter. He turned toward the other woman with a malicious smile, and repeated the question. A sea of light streamed from her. She lifted her head, humble but happy. The cradle began to rock again, and the music surged forth, triumphant and eternal, blending with the sound of the village church bells. He placed his hands over my eyes, and I glided out and downward again. On the way down I learned, almost as though by wireless telegraphy, that the first female figure represented the church that bears only the name church, the church of form without content. The second woman represented God's true congregation, the bride of Christ. I felt desperate at having to awaken again on earth. Everything had become unspeakably small compared with the burning certainty I felt concerning the reality of God. Soon afterward, I passed once more over the snowy landscape with the church bells still ringing. I awoke with the humble awareness that all human beings are dust, and that everything regarded as great is small compared with the things found on the other side. My mother entered my bedroom and came anxiously to my bed. I said, "Mother, you do not know what I have seen." I was told that my face looked transfigured. But when I tried to tell my mother the vision, it was as though a firm hand pressed my mouth shut, and I could not separate my teeth. Spiritualistic experiments. France, the report says, had suddenly begun to take great interest again in spiritualism, and in the mysterious forces supposed to emanate from the human organism. The newest discoveries, X-rays, other forms of radiation, radium, and wireless telegraphy, were being invoked as possible analogies or explanations. In the laboratory where Claude Bernard had often worked, a young woman was then said to be demonstrating experiments of this kind before a select audience of scholars. In connection with the renewed interest, the French academician Edmond Perrier wrote in Le Temps about the famous medium Eusapia Palladino and her spiritualist demonstrations. Scientists and other prominent figures had attended experiments with Palladino as witnesses or controllers, among them Pierre and Marie Curie, Langevin, D'Arsonval, Charles Richet, and the philosopher Henri Bergson. At the sitting described by Perrier, those present included Branly, one of the pioneers of wireless telegraphy, the gynecologist Professor Pozzi, the publisher of Le Matin, Bunau Varilla, and others. The full apparatus of modern science, the article says, was brought to bear upon sittings conducted over 43 days. Eusapia was watched with extreme care. Her hands were held by controllers, her legs were restrained, and small instruments attached to her muscles were intended to register even the slightest movements. She sat upon a scale, intended to show changes in her weight during the experiments. Electroscopes were placed around her, and during the demonstrations, air from the room was collected in vessels for later analysis by competent chemists. At times there was complete darkness, or only a lamp turned very low. On other occasions, full light was used. Spectators sometimes suddenly switched on an electric lamp during experiments conducted in darkness. Yet Perrier wrote, all these precautions produce nothing more decisive than an even more tormenting uncertainty. Detailed records of the sittings were kept and later published. According to them, Eusapia caused heavy tables to rise without touching them, and set footstools and small tables into what was described as a formal promenade, moving gently and apparently taking care not to injure or even touch anyone present. During one such journey, a stool supposedly carried luggage, a wash basin containing sculptor's clay, together weighing 7 kilograms. Handprints were visible in the clay and were attributed to a spirit. At a command, the wash basin and stool could separate. The basin suddenly rose onto a table while the stool climbed, in an almost familiar manner, onto Curie's shoulder. Green sparks were reported to flash suddenly in the air. Curtains billowed and swung forward as though moved by a gust of wind. The two pans of a balance rose and fell in correspondence with movements Eusapia made with her index finger. Those present sometimes felt strange touches, although they could see nothing, and at times they were struck violently. Small objects blackened with soot, so that fingerprints would be visible, were thrown to the floor, yet no trace of a finger or hand could be found in the soot. Glasses began to ring without any visible finger passing around their rims. A guitar sounded, while observers could clearly see that its strings were not being plucked. It was said to be sufficient for Eusapia to make corresponding gestures with her hand, or to scratch the hand of a sitter as though it were a musical instrument. Perrier considered it undeniable that some form of radiation issued from Eusapia's body. A strip of fabric was placed between one of her carefully immobilized feet and the leg of a small table. Suddenly the cloth was seen to ripple, as though lifted by a breath of wind. When the wave in the cloth reached the table itself was said to rise. During these experiments, Eusapia sat before a cabinet formed by 4 black curtains that were not sewn together, so that the interior of the enclosure could be seen. Inside were a white stool and a cat lying on the floor. If someone entered whom Eusapia disliked, she began to groan as though suffering severely, and the visitor was asked to leave. Once the sitting began, the cat quietly slipped away without doing anything remarkable. Suddenly, Eusapia cried plaintively, "Vieni, vieni, come, come." The observer then saw the stool stand upon one leg, rise from the floor, leave the enclosure by slipping between 2 curtains, and finally climb gently onto Professor Pazzi's back. It passed over his head, and then fell heavily onto the table, before which Eusapia and the controllers were seated. One of those present picked up the stool affectionately and held it on his knees as though it were an injured animal. The curtains were also seen to swell outward, as if a gust came from inside the cabinet. A controller, however, claimed that the air movement seemed to arise from the curtains themselves rather than simply blowing them forward. Eusapia also invited observers to verify that a light breeze seemed to issue from her hair, and that this zephyr became so warm at the edges of her fingernails that it could scorch fabric. A spectator held out his cuff. Eusapia touched it with her fingernail and produced a black cross. Careful examination, however, showed that the nail had scratched the cuff no differently from an ordinary fingernail, and that the black color of the cross probably came from pencil graphite. The report thus includes this as an example where a supposedly extraordinary effect admitted a commonplace explanation. A few weeks later, the author happened to attend another spiritualist sitting, this time in the modest middle-class home of 3 highly respectable women, whom he says there was no reason to suspect of fraud. No financial gain or publicity was involved. The 3 women, a mother and her 2 daughters, gathered a circle consisting chiefly of long-standing acquaintances and asked no payment. Out of respect for the hostess, no formal scientific system of control was arranged. The sitting took place in an elegant but very small dining room. The chairs of those seated around the table touched furniture on all sides, so that, according to the account, no one could have walked through the room unnoticed. One of the 2 young women rose and addressed the household spirit, said to be the spirit of an old friend who had died several years earlier. "Mr. X," she called, "we ask you to make your usual visit to us this evening, and bring your usual companions. You will find a stranger here, but he has no evil intentions. He wishes only to learn, and we ask you to convince him." Hardly had she finished when all the furniture in the room, chairs, sideboard, and other pieces, began to crack and make noises. The blinds were carefully closed, the lights extinguished, and the sitting began in complete darkness. The table made especially loud noises. When questions were asked, knocks were said to answer in a very intelligent manner. Soon the participants felt themselves shaken by rough hands. At other times a very small child's hand brushed the arm of one sitter or another. On one occasion it tried unsuccessfully to open the skeptical guest's cufflink. When he suggested that the little hand instead remove a rosette from his buttonhole, he felt a hand at the right buttonhole, although the rosette was actually in the left. After another remark, the hand disappeared. Then Mr. X was invited to offer the new guest a piece of sugar. The sugar bowl was heard opening, and a moment later, without confusing the person, a lump of sugar was placed exactly between the guest's lips. Startled, he dropped it and asked Mr. X to repeat the kindness. He was told that spirits were not patient and never picked up what had fallen to the ground. "Fortunately, I was not offered a grog," the guest joked, "or I would have been drenched." "You can be given a grog too if you wish," the hostess replied. The request had not been anticipated. Objects began moving back and forth. They heard a drawer of the sideboard open, teaspoons clink, a bottle of rum being uncorked, and water poured from a bottle into a glass. Finally, still in complete darkness, the glass of grog was brought between the guest's lips, without, the report says, spilling a single drop. A mandolin then began to sound across all its strings. When a particular piece of music was requested, the carillon from the bells of Cornville was immediately heard. The instrument was asked to place itself beneath the unbelieving guest's chin, and it allegedly obeyed. He noticed that while the music sounded, the strings themselves did not appear to move. When he suddenly turned his head aside, however, he distinctly felt a hairy hand holding the mandolin. The other sitters said they too had sometimes felt this hand, and believed it belonged to a sailor spirit accompanying the household spirit. When the guest asked what would happen if someone seized the hand, or suddenly switched on the electric light, a colonel among those present exclaimed that the medium might suffer such a severe nervous crisis that she could die. No one wished to place a hospitable hostess who had offered sugar, grog, and entertainment in such danger. The article concludes that these more recent sittings in Paris had not succeeded in proving Eusapia Palladino fraudulent, and that, on this occasion at least, the phenomena appeared genuine to the writer. Thinking animals. The public, the article says, once again stood before a problem. A sensational report was circulating through the newspapers. Clever Hans, the horse whom science had supposedly already disposed of, had not merely been rehabilitated, but now had two companions whose performances were even more unbelievable. The owner of the three remarkable animals, Karl Kroll of Elberfeld, published a book titled Thinking Animals. In it he first criticized the scientific report by Oskar Funkst that had led to Clever Hans being considered exposed. Funkst's explanation rested on the claim that Hans's first owner, Wilhelm von Osten, unintentionally transmitted the correct answers to the horse through tiny bodily signals. Funkst claimed to have identified one such signal as an extremely slight movement of von Osten's head, amounting to only 1/5 of a millimeter. The Zentralblatt points out incredulously that Clever Hans was therefore supposed to perceive, with great reliability from a distance of about 2 meters, a head movement only 0.2 of a millimeter in size, something even sharp human observers could not ordinarily perceive with the naked eye. The writer even questions whether a person could intentionally move the head by so small an amount. Scientific circles, the article complains, nevertheless accepted this fragile basis for the judgment. Public reports could omit the suspiciously exact figure and speak merely of fine movements, by which the trainer supposedly telegraphed the answers to Hans, and the public was satisfied with the simple explanation. The author offers this as an illustration of the way scientific exposures could, in his view, be staged when an inconvenient fact had to be explained away in the most naturalistic manner possible. Kroll, the horse's second owner, was not persuaded by Funkst's report. He fitted Clever Hans with blinkers and eventually covered the animal's head with a black cloth. The experiments, he claimed, still succeeded. They also succeeded in darkness, when visual signals could not have been perceived at all. Naturally, Hans first had to be accustomed to the blinkers and other changes. When Funkst suddenly fitted them during his own experiments, the horse failed, supposedly from fear or agitation. Kroll maintained that after proper training Hans gave satisfactory answers even when visible signals were excluded. The Zentralblatt therefore considered the sole material basis of Funkst's explanation destroyed. Kroll went further. He acquired 2 magnificent Arabian stallions, Zarif and Muhammad, and over 3.5 years of patient work systematically taught them not only to count, but, he claimed, to perform the 4 basic operations of arithmetic, calculate powers and roots, and solve equations. The horses were also said to read and even to construct entire sentences by their own intelligence in order to communicate without being directly questioned. Dr. Hermann Decker, writing in Cosmos after personal observation, concluded, "In short, these horses are a problem. They are a problem if they think independently, and they are even more of a problem if the answers are given to them for some unintentional influence." The Zentralblatt notes that this judgment sounded very different from Funkst's. For the occultist, the article continues, the sensational problem immediately raises many questions. The unintentional influence mentioned by Decker, if it came from outside, could be interpreted as telepathy, placing the problem at once within the domain of occultism. If the highly trained horses truly thought independently, then their psyche would have to be regarded as highly developed. The article then introduces a distinctly theosophical and racial theory characteristic of its period, asserting that the animal's monads might stand immediately before ascent into the human kingdom, and making derogatory comparisons with human populations the author considered less developed. It suggests that theosophists might interpret differences in intelligence through a doctrine of progressive and degenerative monads, while materialists would draw a different conclusion, that thinking animals offered further evidence that the human being is only a more highly developed animal, because intellectual powers once regarded as uniquely human had now been demonstrated in animals. The writer nevertheless finds it curious that such experiments had first succeeded with horses rather than apes. According to ordinary evolutionary theory, he says, apes should rank first among animals in intelligence and ability to learn. The occult explanation quoted in the article instead claimed that apes were degenerate human monads, an idea drawn from esoteric doctrine rather than biological science. The Zentralblatt then proposes an even more explicitly occult possibility. Perhaps an invisible intelligence had taken possession of the animal's brains, making it appear as though the animals themselves were independently answering difficult questions. In that case, their own thinking ability would not be exceptionally developed. They would merely be instruments of an intelligence invisible to us. Such animals would have to be described as possessed animals. The writer admits that this explanation was not publicly discussable in 1912, but says it would become discussable if experiments ever demonstrated that the fluidal body of a living person could temporarily take possession of another person's physical body. That would constitute a case analogous to possession. H. P. Blavatsky is cited as having written in Isis Unveiled that she once witnessed an old lama take possession of the body of a 1-year-old child and speak through the child's mouth, while the child's expression supposedly changed from infantile to serious and adult. The article closes by asking whether the famous speaking dog Don might perhaps also be explained through possession. Electricity as an educator. Svante Arrhenius, the famous Swedish physicist, was reported from Stockholm to have conducted unusual experiments on schoolchildren that supposedly indicated an extraordinarily favorable influence of high-voltage electrical currents upon growth and intelligence. According to Lamatin, 2 groups of 50 schoolchildren each were selected. One group worked with its teachers for 6 months in ordinary classrooms. The rooms occupied by the second group were fitted with an electrical apparatus that discharged high-voltage currents into the rooms from the walls. Neither the schoolchildren nor the teachers were told what experiment was being carried out. The surprising result was said to be that after half a year, the electrically treated children had grown 18 millimeters more, on average, than the children in the other group. Their mental development was also said to be superior. Teachers exposed to the electrical treatment likewise reported increased resistance to fatigue. The Zentralblatt adds that it might be worthwhile to carry out similar experiments with Oettinger's so-called radiation disk, particularly the gilded version. Dr. Franz Hartmann, who had suffered for a considerable period that winter from physical and mental inability to work, wrote to the journal that he now felt very well, and believed the improvement was due to his use of an Oettinger radiation disk. The editor also claimed to have witnessed experiments at a local agricultural research station which, in his view, already demonstrated beyond doubt that the disk strongly promoted germination and therefore growth. He promised a fuller report once the experiments were complete. Vadim the Vampire. A murder trial in St. Petersburg had recently attracted widespread attention. An 18-year-old man, Nikolai Ratkovich, was accused of murdering two girls under horrifying circumstances. Several weeks earlier, he had gone with a young and very attractive woman to a cheap St. Petersburg hotel and taken a room. Early in the morning, he woke the porter and urgently demanded to be let out of the building. The nervous haste of the young man aroused the porter's suspicion. The porter went to the room and found the young woman lying motionless on a sofa, covered with clothing. When he tried to remove the garments, Ratkovich attacked him, and a violent struggle followed. Other hotel employees came running at the porter's cries for help. Ratkovich was overpowered and turned over to the police. The hotel staff then attended to the woman. When the clothes covering her were removed, a horrifying scene was revealed. She had been murdered. Ratkovich had first strangled her and then inflicted 35 stab wounds over her body. A note had been fastened to the wall beside the sofa. It read, "Number 2, Revenge on the Beautiful. I took her money as payment for transporting her to the other world, and also because the dead have no use for money. The murderer of this girl and of another beautiful girl is I, Vadim the Vampire." When the presiding judge asked why he had killed the women, Ratkovich reportedly answered, "I liked them so much, I had to kill them." In his diary he had written, "While committing the murders, I was completely without passion. I love only blood. Blood must flow, much blood." The accused had already lived a troubled life. At 15, he traveled through Germany, England, and Egypt. A year before the trial, he returned to St. Petersburg. Being without money, he attempted suicide by hanging and was cut down in time. At 13, he had already attempted to strangle a young girl. During the trial, he declared that murdering young, beautiful girls gave him the greatest delight. Because of his youth, the court sentenced him to 8 years of penal labor. From the Labyrinth of Belief in the Divining Rod. Under this title, Professor L. Weber of Kiel delivered a lecture before the Technical Scientific Association in Hanover on February 16, 1912. An abridged version later appeared in the journal Nature. Weber's standpoint, says the Zentralblatt, is sufficiently indicated by the following statement from his introduction. "Up to the present, I have not succeeded in discovering any aspect of the actual divining rod question whose further investigation would appear worthwhile for the exact sciences of geology and physics. At most, one might say that it would be an attractive problem for the psychologist to study in detail the mental wanderings of the diviners, their origin, and their fantastic elaboration." The editor comments sarcastically that the professor certainly lacked no courage, since he attacked almost every phenomenon associated with the divining rod as unproven or doubtful. The journal was curious to see whether the Association for Clarification of the Divining Rod question in Hanover, which Weber had also criticized sharply, and researchers such as Professor Barrett, Dr. Roth, Dr. Roth, and Dr. Voll would consider it worthwhile to demonstrate that their serious studies were not merely literary curiosities, as Weber had labeled them. The Zentralblatt offered its pages to those attacked for any reply they wished to make. It added mockingly that Professor Weber could already be certain of receiving a place of honor in a future edition of Dr. Max Kemmerich's Culture Curiosa. The editor lamented that the German scholarly world itself allowed such luminaries of science to remain prominent while producing contributions of this kind on the divining rod problem. A letter concerning the years 1911, 1912, and 1913. The journal then prints a letter, dated Berlin, June 2, 1912, from Gustav Ferdinand Müller to the editor. Müller wrote that a prophecy was circulating in small circles, according to which 1911 shall be a year of heat, 1912 a year of flood, and 1913 a year of blood. If so, he said, the year 1912 would bring disaster, not from drought, but from the opposite extreme, flooding. If this forecast also proved accurate, the prediction that 1913 would bring the peak of distress would gain greater credibility. The great floods of the Mississippi, as well as floods in southern Germany, Hungary, and elsewhere, together with the Titanic catastrophe, seemed to Muller to point toward further disaster through water. The harvest that year might therefore be threatened not by drought, but by prolonged rains. He concluded that it would be interesting to see whether the predicted water damage would actually occur. He did not know the origin of the prophecy with its peculiar rhythmic wording. Editorial comment. The editor observes that readers would immediately remember a note in the March issue that, on the basis of a conjunction of the Sun and Sirius, had predicted for 1912 an even hotter summer than that of 1911. Now 1912 was being called a flood year, apparently in direct contradiction to the earlier forecast. The editor argues, however, that the same principal cause, combined with different secondary causes, might produce opposite extreme effects. Increased solar activity would first increase evaporation of water over the entire surface of the Earth. If atmospheric circulation and winds were weak during this period of increased evaporation, rain clouds might release their moisture over the oceans or near their places of origin, leaving continents to suffer drought. Conversely, if winds during increased solar activity drove water vapor toward inhabited continents where it condensed, those regions might suffer extraordinary rainfall and experience a flood year. Thus, the editor argues, the same increased solar activity could produce a heat year in one year and a flood year in the next, depending on how the winds blew. The French officer responsible for the prediction should therefore, in the editor's view, have possessed information about the probable wind currents of 1912 in order to make his forecast more secure. The possibility that certain positions of the heavenly bodies influence the calm or disturbance of the Earth's atmosphere is presented as conceivable. The case is offered as an example of the need, when making a prediction, to consider not only the principal cause, but also secondary causes which may completely reverse its effects. Otherwise, the prophet risks the worst kind of disappointment. Goethe, the editor says, had already recognized this problem. Strange is the prophet's song, doubly strange is what occurs. Applied to astrology, the editor argues this explains why capable astrologers are so rare. Correctly recognizing and weighing planetary influences upon a human destiny is, in his view, an art. And in every art, there are bunglers and masters. The art itself should not be blamed for the greater or lesser skill of its practitioners. Snake stones. Lord Bulwer-Lytton, the article says, knew very well the supposed effect of so-called snake stones. His novel, A Strange Story, described by the journal as a novel of a black magician containing valuable occult hints both in its notes and in the text, includes a description of a stone on Corfu praised as an antidote to snakebite. The description, supplied to Bulwer-Lytton by P.M. Colquhoun and dated Corfu, November 7, 1860, concerns a blue stone. It was oval, about 1.2 inches long, 0.7 inches wide, and 0.3 inches thick. After once having been broken, it had been mounted in gold. According to the account, when someone was bitten by a poisonous snake, the wound was to be opened lengthwise with a lancet or razor, and the stone applied within 24 hours. The stone would then adhere firmly to the wound. When it had completed its work, it would fall off, and the healing was considered complete. The stone was then placed in milk, where it supposedly discharged the poison it had absorbed. After which, the stone could be used again. The stone had, Colquhoun said, belonged from time immemorial to the Ventura family of Corfu, a family of Italian origin, and was so well known that peasants immediately sought its help. Its supposed healing power had not been weakened by its earlier fracture. Its nature and composition were unknown. In one case, 2 persons were bitten by snakes at the same time. The stone was applied to one, and that person survived. It could not be used on the other, who died. The stone was said to have failed only once, and on that occasion it had not been applied until after the 24-hour period had elapsed. Its color was so dark as to be almost indistinguishable from black. Bulwer-Lytton added that Sir Emerson Tennant, in his popular work on Ceylon, described snake stones apparently similar to the one on Corfu, though definitely black and polished to a shine. They were used in the same manner for wounds inflicted by the cobra. Bulwer-Lytton asked whether it might be worthwhile to determine the chemical peculiarities of such stones, and if they truly possess the power to draw out venom introduced by snakebite, whether they might also be used for the bite of a rabid dog. The Zentralblatt concludes that Bulwer-Lytton pursued higher purposes in his novels than mere entertainment. As a true occultist, it says, he wished to teach and stimulate thought. The attentive reader could therefore extract much from Bulwer's works, especially if already equipped with some occult knowledge and skilled in the art of reading between the lines. What is a Medium? By Robert Blum. The May 1912 issue of the Zentralblatt contained an article titled, "Was HPB a Medium?" in which the author attempted to clarify what he called a dangerous confusion surrounding the general concept of a medium. A definition from T.K., author of The Great Psychological Crime, had described a medium as a physically embodied person whose will, self-determining power, and sensory organism are subjected to the will and control of a spiritual actor. Blum says this definition is correct as far as it goes, but describes only one particular case, and must be expanded if it is not to mislead. There are, he says, many kinds of mediumship depending on the phenomena produced, ranging from inspired speech to materialization phenomena, with no sharp boundaries between them. The medium may exist in all degrees of control, from the waking state with full consciousness down to the deepest lethargy and unconsciousness. Blum quotes the same source. The physiology of mediumship is identical with that of hypnotism. Mediumism is psychic hypnotism. In ordinary hypnosis, one intelligence embodied in a physical body is subjected to a second intelligence likewise embodied in a physical body. In mediumism, according to this scheme, the controlling agency is an astral intelligence. Blum describes the supposed physiological process as follows. Like an electrical dynamo, every living human physical organism acts as a kind of catalyst, generating or developing life energy and animal magnetism. These permeate the organism in the form of astral matter, and in the normal waking state, surrounded as relatively compact vortex rings called the aura, remaining more or less under the control of the individual psyche. During sleep, Blum says, these astral vortex rings expand farther and farther, theoretically without limit. The psyche, deprived of its instrument, the brain, increasingly loses control over this astral matter, which in turn comes more under the control of foreign intelligences and external astral impulses. Dreams are said to arise in this way, becoming less distinct as the physiological functions of the brain are more completely suspended. In abnormally constituted or organized individuals, Blum continues, the astral emanations remain in a similar condition, even while awake. According to the degree of this condition, whether inborn or artificially produced by ascetic practices, and according to how much control the psyche retains or loses over the astral matter, one may speak on one side of nervous or hysterical persons, geniuses such as artists, poets, and composers, eccentric persons, hypnotic subjects, and mediums, and on the other side of magicians and adepts. A person in whose astral sphere the familiar mediumistic or spiritualist phenomena arise, spontaneously or otherwise, should, in Blum's view, be called a medium, whether that person remains awake and conscious or must become unconscious. He points to celebrated mediums who were said to display extraordinary phenomena while fully conscious, including the seeress of Prevorst and Madame Desperats. Blum had previously asserted that H.P. Blavatsky was a medium. He says he used Annie Besant's recent booklet, H.P. Blavatsky and the Masters of Wisdom, not as a psychical researcher, but to show that the then leading figure of Theosophy herself supported his conclusion by quoting the person she considered the most competent eyewitness to the mysterious phenomena occurring around Blavatsky. Whether that eyewitness was an uncle, or as Blum jokes, a spiritualist aunt, did not change the essential point. According to the report, HPB was a medium. When Blavatsky served as amanuensis or secretary to the Mahatmas while Isis Unveiled was being written, Blum says entire passages were allegedly written while she was asleep and therefore unconscious. In the morning, she supposedly had no knowledge that something had been written, what had been written, or how. Thus, Bloom concludes, Olcott as well as Sinnott confirmed his assertion that HPB was a medium. Bloom insists that this in no way diminishes her fame. He repeats his earlier praise. Blavatsky was the greatest woman of the 19th century, and it is her immortal merit to have opposed the crude materialism of our age with the greatest effectiveness, by being the first and only one to direct the attention of the Eastern world toward occultism through her outstanding works, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. In any event, Bloom says it is neither a sin nor a disgrace to be a medium, only somewhat dangerous. Mediumship, in the theosophical racial terminology of the period, is described as still abnormal for humanity of the present fifth root race, but as a condition that, according to Blavatsky's own view, would become normal among individuals of the coming sixth root race. He points to her description of the seeress of Prevorst as a cosmic premature birth as evidence of this idea. Book reviews: The Finer Forces of Nature and the Science of Breath, from the Sanskrit original by Rama Prasad. German translation by Heinz Whitman. The reviewer says that a work of this kind, drawn from ancient Indian natural philosophy, produces an impression fundamentally different from the products of modern thought. An elevated philosophical spirit, a bold and magnificent system, and, in the reviewer's judgment, an immense transcendental knowledge speak through its worldview. Because esoteric teachings had, in the reviewer's opinion, repeatedly found later confirmation in discoveries by modern researchers, and had gradually been reproduced in modern theories, the reviewer felt justified in expecting that propositions in this work, not yet demonstrated by European science, might likewise eventually prove real for the West, just as they were regarded as realities by the ancient Hindu and by students of the Vedas. The work is called A New Gift from East to West, and Rama Prasad is thanked for opening another portion of treasures otherwise chiefly accessible to Brahmins as guardians of tradition. The reviewer hopes the book will receive the attention it deserves from physicists, physiologists, psychologists, cosmologists, and others. The Immortality of the Soul, according to the latest natural historical and philosophical research, by Dr. Jule S. Spiegler, 3rd enlarged edition. The reviewer admits that he could derive from the book no actual proof either for or against the immortality of the soul. At most, it strengthened his conviction that speculative philosophy by itself cannot decide the problem of survival after death. He hopes other readers may fare better, but complains of what he calls dreadful spelling errors, and finds the appendix's critique of spiritualism especially amateurish. As an example, he quotes 2 sentences mocking spirit seers by asking whether they possessed a wireless telegraph capable of summoning spirits from spheres 60 or more miles away so that they could answer questions. The quoted author dismisses the idea as absurd and calls modern spiritualism the illusion of highly excited enthusiasts whose fantasies constitute the spirit world. On the Trail of the Soul, by Paul Krojanker. Know thyself, and you will know the universe and the gods. Inscription at the Temple of Delphi. The struggle for deeper knowledge is unceasing. Whoever understands the searching spirit of our age discovers that it belongs to the Sphinx, to the ancient riddle of the human being. In the present day, there is an especially strong longing for real knowledge of the nature of the soul and the meaning of life. Humanity is only now awakening from an intoxication produced by a technical civilization of the highest development, a civilization that has surrounded us with previously undreamed of comfort. To many, this civilization seemed an end in itself. Pride in what had been accomplished, together with the impressive discoveries of the natural sciences, produced a worldview founded entirely on the visible world, and rejecting any supersensory interpretation of world events or of human inner life. Now the poor giant slowly awakens, and despite all outward splendor, finds itself unsatisfied and empty. Hunger stirs again, and drives humanity toward the satisfaction of the needs of mind and soul. In the present age, however, the soul must be rediscovered for metaphysics. Modern metaphysics no longer rests merely on speculation. In the work of its contemporary representatives, it draws partly upon mysteries of antiquity that have been partially unveiled, while also addressing the intellectually trained mind of the modern age, and pointing toward new forms of experimental investigation. Its opposition to the presently accepted exact method lies chiefly in this: the metaphysician begins by assuming the existence of a soul independent of the body. The physiologist, on the other hand, declares that investigation discovers only substantial structures whose proper functioning produces what we call the soul, a psychology without a psyche. The opposition between these two ways of understanding is still great, but this may serve the matter itself. As the saying has it, let there be opposition between you. An alliance would still be premature. If you separate in your searching, truth may first be recognized. According to psychophysiology, the external world speaks to human consciousness through 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and feeling. Definite organs correspond to these senses. Through the nerves, they conduct appropriate stimuli to definite centers in the gray cortex of the cerebrum. It has been shown that such stimuli are conducted at a speed of about 30 meters per second. Fatigue delays this transmission. Injuries or diseases of the nerves may finally make it impossible. There is therefore no doubt that our power of perception depends upon normal functioning of the nerves and brain. But one principal question remains unanswered. How does the stimulus conducted to the brain become conscious? The process of nervous transmission itself has been described by some writers as chemical and physical, by others as movement and molecular rearrangement among the substances composing nervous tissue, and by still others as the release of an electromagnetic current. Once the impulse has been conducted to the brain and movements have occurred among the molecules of the brain cells, the observable process is at an end. That is all that can be directly established. How, then, do pleasure and displeasure, joy and pain, and the whole complicated inner life of the human being arise from the transmission of external impressions? It is noteworthy that the various sensory nerves and their pathways do not differ anatomically. Their difference is functional. Experiment distinguishes a motor pathway serving voluntary motion from a sensory pathway serving sensation. Yet from a purely physiological standpoint, it remains mysterious why a musical chord may give pleasure, while the stronger contact of a sharp instrument with the skin produces pain. Even pain is not experienced equally by different people when the strength of the stimulus is the same. A person expecting pain may greatly diminish the sensation by diverting the activity of thought, that is, by an act of will. A very anxious person in the same situation may feel the pain 1,000-fold, and may feel it even before the instrument has touched the limb. In such a case, the idea runs ahead of the stimulus. The mere expectation of a sensation can be sufficient to call it forth even when no external stimulus is present. Thus the injury is a physical event, nervous conduction a physiological event, but sensation itself a psychic event. The reciprocal relations between body and soul are thereby placed in a clearer light. It is the soul that suffers and rejoices, that sees and hears, as ordinary language has always expressed it. We should perhaps place more confidence in the genius of language, which does not create its distinctions without reason. Language also created the concept of spirit as distinct from soul. Spirit works with the elements of will and representation, or mental imagery, and acts upon the body through the soul. Suppose someone unexpectedly receives a letter announcing the sudden death of a friend. What occurs? First, the message is intellectually understood. When the person forms a mental image of the reported fact, the soul is violently affected. These inner agitations then act with great force upon the central nervous system and produce many bodily manifestations. The cause of the bodily phenomena is therefore a psychic event. And for this particular chain of reactions, it makes no difference whether the report is actually true. The idea alone can be sufficient to produce the same effects. We are therefore not sad because we weep. We weep because we are sad. The primary thing is the thought. It is followed by emotional movements of the soul, and these, through the central nervous system, produce bodily states. The soul itself feels, rejoices, and suffers. The bodily effect corresponds to the strength of the condition of the soul. Joy and pleasure increase the vital powers and make the pulse beat more strongly, while pain and discouragement act as restraints. Yet a higher force may intervene and restrain the excitations of the soul, the power of spirit. Spirit works upon the body through the soul. Only in this way, the author argues, can we understand how physiological processes may be influenced and governed by will and mental imagery. Dr. Paul Levy, in his work on natural formation of the will, writes that the idea becomes sensation, but that an idea may also prevent sensation or abolish it again. Knowledge of these processes is not merely theoretical, it has practical importance because it indicates the possibility of regulating our life of sensation and influencing unpleasant bodily states by deliberately directing our mental attitude. The strength of attention and expectation is decisive. Ordinarily, human attention is scattered. We yield to the many impressions flowing toward us, and our thoughts remain only briefly with one object before passing to another. This is the condition called polyideism. The condition is entirely different when we succeed in directing attention upon a single thing. The more completely this occurs, the more the surrounding world and its many impressions disappear from awareness. Consciousness becomes narrowed. If its whole content is directed toward the expectation of a bodily event, that event may then appear. This psychological condition is called monoideism. The philosopher Karl Duprel called monoideism the key to magical psychology. It is called magical because in this interpretation, the operative forces lie in the unconscious. Many puzzling cases in which a powerful influence upon mind and soul appears to produce visible bodily effects are understood by the author in this way. Religiously excited persons in states of intense ecstasy, who immerse themselves deeply in the sufferings of Christ, has been reported to display stigmata, bodily imitations of wounds. Visitors to Lourdes, pilgrims to Mecca, and worshippers in Indian temples have likewise continually reported so-called miraculous cures. Whatever abuses may have occurred around relics and places of pilgrimage, the author maintains that a number of healings were confirmed by observers whom he regarded as reliable. In all such cases, he interprets inner elevation and unwavering confidence as producing the condition of monoideism, and thereby releasing hidden capacities of the soul. Similar states, he says, can be produced artificially in deep hypnosis, providing an experimental demonstration of the influence of mental representation upon the bodily sphere. The forces of spirit and soul considered here, like the other forces known in nature, are said to operate according to definite laws and to be connected with a substance. Force without substance, according to this view, is inconceivable. The substance in question must be imagined as extraordinarily fine, perhaps as a condition of the ether. The author argues that contemporary investigations into the nature of matter do not contradict such an assumption. A mere idea, in this account, does not act directly upon the organs. Another force must be released through it. This force was once called the vital spirit, and later animal magnetism. Karl von Reichenbach, a physicist whose writings were again receiving attention, reported from many experiments the discovery of a luminous dynamic fluid permeating and surrounding the human body. The author then points to a German edition of a work by Professor Derville on the physics of animal magnetism, which he says confirms and extends Reichenbach's experiments. The existence of a dynamic body serving as bearer of vital force and of the psychic and spiritual capacities of the human being, he argues, had been repeatedly asserted in recent research. Albert de Rocha, director of the Polytechnic Institute at Grenoble, experimented with what he called the exteriorization of sensibility. According to these reports, he succeeded in isolating this dynamic body and in producing effects attributed to it independently of the physical body. Metaphysical writers associated such a body with what Paracelsus had called the formative body, the archeus, the architect of the physical organism. Anyone who knows something of the language of the body, the article continues, can observe how it is influenced by dominating passions and by persistent thoughts directed toward definite things, so that a person's outward appearance becomes to some extent an image of inner life. Through this route, metaphysics also arrives at a monistic conception of the human being. The article next refers to observations by the English hospital physician Dr. W.J. Kilmer, who had recently published the results of 4 years of work in a book on the human aura and on attempts to make it visible with the aid of chemically prepared light screens. There are still other paths, the author says, that may lead us onto the trail of the soul. Some of the greatest doubts concern the relationship between the human being and the brain. Is a person mentally and morally dependent upon the brain, or can the brain be used as an instrument? Psychophysiology teaches that the brain of a newborn child is still immature. According to the account presented here, the cortical centers and their connections with one another and with the sense organs are not yet fully developed, while primarily the vegetative system is functioning. The author interprets the child's consciousness as responding to external impressions and reacting repeatedly to similar stimuli. In this way, the child gradually gathers experience, seeks impressions associated with pleasure, and avoids those associated with discomfort. Through thousands of repeated attempts, the child slowly learns to command the limbs of the body. In learning, it also develops the brain and nervous pathways needed for such control. The knower, in this interpretation, is that which reacts to all influences. The nerves that report them possess no more consciousness than telegraph wires. For this reason, the physiologist's prayer is cited as saying that the child thinks before it can speak. The discussion of the relation between consciousness and the brain continues in the next portion of the volume.